Hi guys, and welcome to America History Tales. Tonight we step straight into the year 1936, into the bones of a Midwestern farmhouse that feels like it is breathing slowly under layers of snow. Outside, a blizzard presses against the world like a heavy hand, swallowing fences, swallowing roads, swallowing the idea that anything else exists beyond this warm little kitchen you're about to stand in. Inside, there is the steady glow of a wood stove, the smell of soot and old wood, and that strange comfort of people trying to survive winter 1 hour at a time. You probably won't survive this if you were dropped here without preparation. And honestly, most people of the time barely did. You are not just watching history, you're inside it. Your boots feel damp, your fingers sting from cold that never really leaves the walls. Somewhere deeper in the house, something creaks like it remembers every winter that came before this one. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what your local time is right now. It always feels a little unreal knowing how far this story travels. Now, dim the lights. The kitchen welcomes you first, not with silence, but with sound. A kettle shifting on an iron. A soft pop from burning logs. The low murmur of wind trying and failing to break through thick wooden walls. This farmhouse in 1936 is not new. It has that lived-in feeling, where every floorboard knows the weight of tired feet and every nail has long since stopped questioning its purpose. You are in the American Great Plains region, where winter in the 1930s often arrived like a sentence that could not be appealed. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. In the winter of 1936, record-breaking cold waves swept across large parts of the United States, killing thousands and freezing rivers solid. This is not exaggeration, it is documented hardship, the kind that shaped entire federal responses like New Deal relief programs. Though historians still argue whether those programs truly reached the most isolated farm families in time to matter. Outside this kitchen window, the blizzard thickens. Snow does not fall so much as it builds itself into walls. The glass is already fogged at the edges. You can barely see the barn. You can barely trust distance. The farmhouse belongs to a family that has learned to live with uncertainty as if it were another relative sitting at the table. Depression-era farming in 1936 is not romantic. It is accounting, it is rationing, it is deciding whether seed corn gets planted or eaten. You step closer to the stove. The warmth hits your face like memory returning. This stove is cast iron, heavy enough that moving it would require at least 2 strong people and a stubborn refusal to quit halfway. It is the heart of the house. It cooks, it heats, it dries wet socks. It even shapes sleep, because everyone gathers near it until exhaustion finally wins. A quirky detail from rural winter life emerges here. Some farming communities reportedly use snow listening tricks, where people would step outside briefly at night to hear the pitch of wind in snowbanks, believing it could predict whether drifts would block barns by morning. It sounds half folklore, half necessity, and entirely like something born from too many winters with too little certainty. You shift your attention to the table. It is not grand, it is scarred wood, softened by years of elbows and hurried meals. A cast-iron pan sits cooling, and the smell of simple food lingers. Potato, maybe beans, maybe something preserved from last summer's cellar stores. Nothing is wasted in this world, because waste is a luxury that never survived the Great Depression. You hear movement upstairs, slow, careful. People down here do not rush unless something is burning or breaking. The house speaks in layers. Upstairs creaks, stove pops, wind hammers the outside like it wants entry but does not know the language of doors. You settle into the rhythm of the space. And that is when the second truth of this place begins to show itself. Survival here is not dramatic. It is repetitive. Feed the fire, check the windows, listen to the wind, repeat. A small oil lamp flickers on a side shelf, throwing shadows that stretch and contract like breathing silhouettes. Historians still argue whether constant low light in rural Depression-era homes subtly altered sleep cycles, making people rest earlier but more lightly, always half aware of the night. You imagine the farmer who lives here. He's not a hero in the cinematic sense. He's tired, his hands are dry, cracked from cold water and rope. His thoughts are probably somewhere between next year's crop and whether this roof will hold another storm. Another historical layer settles in. By 1936, the Dust Bowl conditions had already reshaped large parts of American agriculture, forcing migration and policy change. That reality sits quietly behind every farm like this one, even if snow now replaces dust in this particular season. You glance toward the window again. The world outside has almost disappeared. Fence posts are gone. The yard is gone. Even the familiar outline of the barn is fading like a memory being erased by wind. A fringe belief from the era surfaces in scattered rural accounts. Some isolated communities spoke of sky currents, imagined invisible rivers of air that carried storms with intention, as if weather had moods or direction beyond science. Modern meteorology rejects this, of course. But in 1936, when prediction tools were limited, it is easy to understand why people reached for explanations that felt almost alive. The kitchen remains warm, stubbornly so. That warmth feels almost defiant, like the house is refusing to surrender. You hear a chair scrape somewhere behind you. Not alarming, just human. Someone else is here, sharing this small pocket of heat against a vast white world. The presence is grounding. It reminds you that isolation is never total, even when the blizzard says otherwise. Outside, the wind rises again, and the farmhouse responds with a low groan through its beams. It does not break, it endures, and you begin to understand the quiet agreement of this place. The storm can have the fields, the cold can have the roads, but this kitchen, this small circle of light and yawn and breath, remains claimed by life. The warmth of the kitchen still clings to your skin as you drift your attention back toward the window. But something has changed outside. The world is no longer just snowing, it is closing, slowly, steadily, like a hand curling into a fist around the farmhouse. What was once a faint white haze has thickened into a moving wall. The dirt road that once cut through the fields is already disappearing under layers of drifting snow, each gust rearranging the landscape like it has no memory of what came before. You stand there, close enough to the glass that your breath fogs it again. The condensation blooms outward, briefly hiding the outside entirely when it clears. The road is almost gone. In 1936 rural America, this kind of isolation was not unusual. A mainstream historical fact anchors the moment here. During severe winter storms of the Great Depression era, many Midwestern farms could become completely cut off for days or even weeks at a time because road clearing was not yet standardized or mechanized in rural counties. County budgets were thin, equipment scarce, and priorities often went to towns rather than isolated homesteads. The result was a kind of enforced quiet, where families simply learn to wait. You begin to understand that waiting is not passive here. It is work. It is preparation. It is survival stretched across time. Outside, the dirt road that once connected this farmhouse to the nearest township is now unrecognizable. It is not buried so much as rewritten. Snowdrifts rise in uneven waves, shaped by wind that seems to prefer angles and edges rather than smoothness. Fence posts vanish one by one, swallowed at their bases first, then halfway up, then entirely. You notice how the barn across the yard has become a ghost shape. Not gone, but softened into uncertainty. The distance between house and barn feels larger than it should, as if the storm has stretched it. A quirky rural detail emerges in your imagination as you remember something the older voices of farming communities used to say. Some families would tie long ropes from the farmhouse door to the barn, not because they so expected to travel in safety, but because whiteouts could erase all sense of direction in seconds, in extreme storms. Those ropes were lifelines, guiding hands through invisible space. Whether widely practiced or more localized folklore, historians still argue whether such rope systems were common or just survival myths repeated across generations. You step away from the window and back toward the stove, but your attention remains outside. The wind has a different sound now. Less like something passing through, more like something building. It presses against the farmhouse in irregular pulses, testing weak points, searching for gaps. The kitchen light flickers slightly, not from electricity failure, but from the draft shifting air around the lamp flame. Everything here is dependent on balance, flame, fuel, structure, breath. You hear movement deeper in the house. A floorboard creaks slow and deliberate. Someone is likely checking doors, shutters, maybe the barn latch. In homes like this, during storms like these, routines are sacred, not because they are comforting, but because they are necessary. Another layer of historical reality settles in. Rural electrification in the United States was still incomplete in 1936. Many farms remained off-grid, relying on oil lamps, wood stoves, and hand-pumped water. The Rural Electrification Act had only just begun to reshape that landscape, and historians still argue how quickly its benefits truly reached isolated regions like this one. Progress was real but uneven, and winter often exposed the gaps. You can almost feel those gaps now, not as absence but as vulnerability, the kind that creeps in through window seams and under door frames. Outside, the snow intensifies again. It no longer falls in gentle patterns, it moves sideways, driven by wind that scrapes the land clean of definition. The road is fully gone now. If you had not seen it earlier, you would not know it ever existed. The farmhouse feels smaller in contrast, not physically, but perceptually, as if the storm has inflated everything around it and left this one structure floating in a white void. You imagine what travel meant in this time. Horses or early trucks attempting routes that were never guaranteed. A delayed supply wagon could mean a family stretching meals, rationing, feed for animals, or simply doing without. This is not dramatic survival. It is administrative survival. Quiet math against hunger. Another memory from rural accounts surfaces like a whisper from the land itself. Some farmers reportedly marked pathways using tall poles or even discarded saplings, pushing them into snowbanks so they could later trace routes between buildings when visibility dropped. Whether widely documented or regionally remembered, it reflects a truth of adaptation. People mark their world just so they could find it again. You look again towards the window. The glass is now streaked with wind-driven frost. Patterns form and dissolve like handwriting you cannot read. The barn is barely visible, and even that is generous. It is more sensation than sight. Inside, the stove continues its steady rhythm. Crackle, settle, exhale. Heat rises unevenly through the room, pooling near the ceiling, slipping down along the walls. You become aware of how much this house depends on constant attention. Fire cannot be left alone. Not for long, not in weather like this. A faint sound comes from above, maybe footsteps, maybe just the house shifting under wind pressure. Old farmhouses in this region often develop what locals called winter voices, creaks and groans that only appeared when temperature dropped sharply. Wood contracts, nails tighten, entire structures adjust like living things bracing against cold. A single lantern is moved somewhere behind you. Its glow shifts, stretching shadows across the kitchen table, making familiar objects look unfamiliar for a moment. Historians still argue whether prolonged exposure to such a low, flickering light influenced sleep depth and dream patterns in rural households, particularly during long winter confinements. You find yourself listening more closely now, not for danger exactly, but for continuity. Sound becomes proof that the world is still functioning in recognizable ways. Outside, the road is completely erased. Even memory of it feels fragile now. The land has become uniform, a single white surface with no reference points. It's the kind of emptiness that disorients even when viewed safely from inside. And yet, inside the farmhouse, there is order, not abundance, but structure. The stove, the table, the lamp, the unseen routines of people who know exactly where everything must be. Even without looking, you begin to sense the emotional shift that comes with isolation like this. It is not panic. It is narrowing. The world reduces itself to what is immediately present: heat, shelter, breath, the sound of wind that will not be answered. And still, the farmhouse holds. The snow keeps building its argument against the door, but the door does not respond. It simply remains, as it always has, separating inside from outside with stubborn, imperfect determination. The kitchen does not change quickly in a place like this. It shifts the way glaciers move, slow and certain, almost unnoticeable until you realize everything has been rearranged. The stove that felt like simple warmth a moment ago now feels like a presence, something active, something that demands attention the way a living thing would. You move closer to it again, and this time you notice details you did not fully register before. The iron surface is uneven with age, darkened by decades of soot and repeated heat cycles. The metal radiates a steady pulse of warmth that is not just comfort, but necessity. In 1936, on farms like this, the wood stove is not an appliance, it is infrastructure. It is survival condensed into iron and flame. A mainstream historical fact settles into the room as naturally as the heat itself. During the Great Depression, rural households across the United States depended heavily on wood and coal-burning stoves for both cooking and heating, and fuel consumption in winter often doubled or even tripled compared to summer months. Many families spent significant portions of their time simply gathering, chopping, and rationing fuel to keep a single stove alive through the coldest seasons. Government programs like early New Deal relief efforts and local works progress initiatives occasionally helped. But distribution was uneven, especially in remote farming areas. Historians still argue whether such aid fundamentally transformed rural living standards or merely softened the edges of already existing hardship. You glance toward the wood box near the stove. It is not overflowing, it never is. Each log has been chosen carefully, stacked with intention. Nothing here is accidental. Even the placement of wood reflects foresight. Because waste is a risk no one can afford, the fire inside the stove shifts with a soft, hollow sound, like something adjusting its posture. Heat rolls outward in waves, pushing back against the cold that presses through every wall seam. You can almost see how the house organizes itself around this point. Everything orients toward the stove, chairs, table, even the direction people stand when they pause to think. A movement from memory or imagination pulls you deeper into the rhythm of the house. Someone is tending the fire, not hurriedly, but with practiced care. A hand opens the stove door. A brief rush of orange light spills into the room before being contained again. A log is nudged forward, another is added. The language of fire here is learned slowly, through repetition and necessity. You notice the smell now more clearly. It is a layered scent. Burnt wood, faint mineral ash, and something faintly sweet from whatever was last cooked. In Depression-era farm kitchens, smells lingered because ventilation was minimal in winter. Windows stayed shut, doors stayed sealed. Heat was more valuable than freshness. A quirky rural detail emerges through this haze of warmth. In some farming communities, people reportedly read soot patterns on the stovepipes as informal weather predictions. Thick, dark buildup was thought by some to signal a harsh upcoming winter, while lighter ash was associated with milder conditions. There is no scientific foundation for this practice, but it persisted in scattered oral traditions, blending observation with hope in a world where forecasting tools were limited. You imagine someone glancing up at the stovepipe now and then, not as superstition alone, but as habit. When your life depends on weather, even the smallest pattern becomes meaningful. The kitchen begins to feel more alive as the stove strengthens. Shadows shift, surfaces gain definition. The table, which earlier felt like a resting point in darkness, now reveals scratches and worn grooves, evidence of years of meals prepared under conditions just like this one. You run your attention along those details, and it is easy to forget how many hands have touched this same wood, how many winters it has witnessed. Outside, the blizzard continues its relentless motion, but it feels more distant now, as if the stove has created a boundary that is not physical but perceptual. The house is still under siege from weather, yet inside this room there is structure that refuses to bend. You hear a kettle being filled somewhere off to the side. Water in 1936 rural homes often came from hand-pumped wells or melted snow during heavy storms like this. Even the simple act of boiling water carries labour behind it. Nothing is instantaneous. Everything is earned in small physical steps. A soft clink of metal signals the kettle being set onto the stove. The sound is small. In this environment it feels important. It is part of a sequence that has likely repeated thousands of times in this house. Fill, heat, wait, use, repeat. Another historical layer settles in quietly during the 1930s, especially in isolated rural regions. Kitchen spaces often served as multifunctional centres for work, communication, and rest. Families gathered there not only for meals but for planning chores, repairing tools, and sometimes even hosting visiting neighbours during storms. Historians still argue whether this centralisation of domestic life has strengthened family cohesion or simply concentrated labour burdens into a single overheated room. You can almost feel both interpretations at once. The warmth is comforting, but it also carries responsibility. To stay near it, someone must constantly tend it. A faint shift in the air tells you the stove is reaching a steadier burn. The room stabilises. Heat becomes consistent rather than fluctuating. This consistency matters more than it might seem. In winters like 1936, temperature stability inside a farmhouse could determine whether pipes froze, whether food preserved properly, whether sleep was restful or interrupted by cold drafts. You find yourself drawn again to the idea of rhythm. Fire rhythm, house rhythm, human rhythm. Everything here is timed around survival cycles that modern life rarely requires in such direct form. A second quirky detail surfaces from rural memory. Some households reportedly kept a firestone, a specific rock or a metal piece believed informally to help regulate flame consistency when placed near the stove, though in reality it likely served no functional purpose beyond habit and reassurance. These small rituals gave structure to long winters, turning uncertainty into routine. You imagine someone placing such an object carefully near the stove without comment, simply because it has always been done that way. The kitchen now feels fully awake, not noisy, but aware. The stove crackles with confidence. The lamplight steadies. Even the walls seem less strained, as if the house itself relaxes slightly when the fire is properly established. Outside, the storm remains unchanged, but inside, the perception of it shifts. It is no longer overwhelming, it is background pressure, something to be endured rather than feared. You notice your own breathing pouring in response to the room's warmth. That is what this space does. It synchronizes bodies to its pace. Slow heat, slow movement, slow time, and still. The stove continues its quiet work, turning wood into life one log at a time. The warmth of the stove follows you as you settle into the rhythm of the farmhouse. But something heavier lingers beneath it now. It is not the storm outside, it is the silence inside the people who live here. The kind of silence that comes when every decision has a price attached to it. You notice it first in the way objects are handled. Nothing is tossed, nothing is rushed, nothing is taken for granted. Even the simple act of shifting a chair feels deliberate, as if movement itself costs effort that must be justified. In 1936, rural America, especially during the height of the Great Depression, this is not unusual. The entire household economy operates on restraint. Records from the era show that farm families across the Midwest were often balancing debts that never quite disappeared. Mortgages were stretched thin across bad harvests, falling crop prices, and unpredictable weather. You are standing inside that reality now, where every creak of the house feels tied to numbers written in ledgers somewhere far away. You imagine the farmer who owns this place. He's not just fighting winter. He's negotiating with banks, with seed costs, with land taxes that do not pause for storms. A single failed crop season can ripple forward years. That is the quiet pressure that fills this kitchen, even when no one speaks about it. Outside, the blizzard continues to press against the farmhouse, but inside the tension is different. It is memory shaped into habit. You can almost feel the weight of decisions that were never fully resolved. Should more land be planted this year or less? Should livestock be sold early or held longer in hope of better prices? Each choice carries uncertainty, and uncertainty is its own kind of weather. A layer of historical context settles into the room. The broader backdrop here is the Great Depression, a global economic collapse that reshaped rural life across the United States. Federal programs under Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, including agricultural efforts like the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, attempted to stabilize prices by controlling production. Some farms benefited. Others were left confused or excluded depending on timing, region, and eligibility. The uneven reach of these programs remains a subject of ongoing academic discussion, particularly when examining isolated rural communities that were difficult for administrators to consistently access. You look at the table again, it is not just wood, it is accounting space. Meals here are planned around what is left, not what is desired. You begin to understand that scarcity is not always dramatic. It is quiet. It looks like smaller portions. Reused containers, repaired tools instead of replaced ones. A soft sound draws your attention. Somewhere in the house, paper is being handled. You imagine a ledger book opening, pages worn at the edges, numbers written carefully, then rewritten, then crossed out, in many farmhouses of this period. Financial records were kept at the kitchen table because that was where the light and heat were strongest. Work and survival shared the same surface. You feel the emotional texture of it now. Not despair exactly, but constant calculation. Even rest has limits. A subtle but important detail emerges from rural life in the 1930s. Many families engaged in what could be described as informal barter economies. Eggs might be traded for flour, labour exchanged for repair work, firewood shared between neighbours with the expectation of future return. A small but meaningful exchange network formed in places where cash was scarce. A quirky oral tradition from some farming communities even mentions favour books, unofficial mental ledgers where people tracked debts of kindness rather than money. Though documentation of this practice varies widely and may reflect localised storytelling more than widespread habit, you imagine how such a system would feel not entirely free, but not entirely bound to currency either. A different kind of accounting, one based on memory and trust. The wind outside shifts sharply, and the house responds with a low, tired groan. Wood expands and contracts in the cold. Nails tighten. Walls adjust. The farmhouse is not static. It's constantly negotiating with temperature. You become aware of how closely survival here is tied to adaptation. Nothing is fixed. Everything is conditional. Another layer of economic reality surfaces as you think about crop failure, the Dust Bowl period. Part of the broader environmental and agricultural crisis overlapping the Great Depression had already devastated large sections of farmland across the plains. While this particular farmhouse is wrapped in snow rather than dust, the economic shockwaves are similar. Prices for wheat and corn had collapsed earlier in the decade, leaving many farmers producing more but earning less. There is a quiet irony in that system. Abundance could still mean poverty. You glance toward a shelf where jars are stored. Preserved food lines them in muted colours. Beans, maybe peaches, maybe pickled vegetables from last summer. Each jar represents a decision made months earlier, a choice to prepare for exactly this moment. Preservation is not just culinary, it is financial planning disguised as food storage. A faint memory-like detail surfaces from rural accounts of the time. Some farm families reportedly kept small emergency sacks hidden in barns or loft spaces containing grain or dried goods reserved strictly for worst-case scenarios, whether universal or not. Such practices reflect a mindset where preparedness was not optional, but embedded into daily thinking. You can almost feel that mindset in the air here. Every object has a secondary purpose, every space has a backup function. The stove crackles again, pulling your attention back to the present warmth. It does not solve the economic strain, but it suspends it. Heat creates a temporary illusion of stability for a few moments. Nothing outside the kitchen requires immediate action. You notice how the family moves in this space, not hurried, not idle, just efficient. Hands know where things are without looking. Conversations, if they happen, are brief and practical. Emotional expression is not absent, but it is economized like everything else. A thought lingers in the back of your mind. How does a place like this shape a person over time, not in dramatic ways, but in posture, in patience, in the way Salonnas becomes acceptable company? Scholarly interpretations of rural Depression-era life often diverge on this point. Some researchers emphasize resilience and communal adaptation, highlighting how families developed strong interdependence under pressure. Others suggest that chronic uncertainty created long-term psychological strain that was normalized rather than addressed. The debate continues in historical literature, particularly when examining oral histories from survivors who describe both deep hardship and unexpected moments of stability. You stand in the overlap of those interpretations now. The kitchen does not choose one version, it holds both. Outside, the blizzard continues its steady erasure of the world. Inside, the farmhouse continues its quiet accounting of survival. Heat against cold, scarcity against planning, memory against uncertainty, and through it all, the simple fact remains that tomorrow will require the same careful attention as today, regardless of weather or wealth. The wind outside changes its voice again, and this time it sounds less like pressure and more like movement with intention. You notice it in the way the farmhouse responds, the subtle shiver of walls that have endured far more winters than anyone inside can easily count. Snow does not simply fall now, it travels sideways, dragged by forces that reshape the landscape in real time. You find yourself drawn back to the window. The glass is colder than before, and faint crystalline patterns have begun to form along its edges. Outside, the world has lost almost all definition. There is no road, no fence line, no clear separation between ground and sky. Everything has blended into a single shifting surface of white. In 1936, winters like this were not rare anomalies. They were part of a broader climatic pattern affecting North America during that decade. Weather records from the era describe sharp, cold snaps sweeping across the Midwest, sometimes dropping temperatures far below seasonal averages for extended periods. This is part of the historical climate record, and it helped shape everything from agricultural planning to migration decisions. Yet even with those records, prediction remained limited. Weather forecasting technology was still developing, and rural households often relied on local observation rather than centralized data. Some contemporary researchers suggest that this gap between scientific forecasting and lived experience contributed to a culture of improvisation in rural communities, where people learned to interpret the environment directly rather than depend on distant reports. You step away from the window again as the stove gives a small, steady pop. The sound is almost comforting now, like punctuation in a long sentence. Fire continues its work without interruption, converting wood into heat, heat into survival, survival into another night endured. A new detail emerges in your awareness of the house. Sound travels differently here during storms. The wind muffles distant noises, but amplifies the interior ones. A chair scraping across the floor becomes significant. A footstep on the stairs feels amplified. Even breathing feels closer, more present. You imagine what nighttime must feel like in this environment. Darkness here is not empty. It is layered. There is the darkness outside, absolute and moving. And then there is the darkness inside, shaped by oil lamps and firelight constantly shifting as fuel burns down. A historical note settles quietly into this space. Many rural homes in the 1930s used kerosene lamps as their primary indoor lighting source. Electricity, where available, was often unreliable or limited in reach. Rural electrification efforts were expanding during this period, but access varied widely depending on geography and infrastructure. This uneven distribution of modern utilities is frequently noted in historical studies of rural life. Though interpretations differ on how quickly daily living standards truly changed, you notice a lamp on a nearby surface, its flame small but steady. The glass chimney around it is slightly smudged from repeated use. It does not illuminate the entire room evenly. Instead, it creates zones of brightness and shadow, giving the kitchen a layered appearance. Corners fall away into darkness, surfaces closest to the flame glow softly. In that uneven light, objects take on different meanings. A simple chair becomes a silhouette of rest. A shelf becomes a wall of memory. Even the stove feels more monumental, its shape emphasized by flickering contrast. A faint quirky observation from rural accounts comes to mind. Some households reportedly used reflective surfaces like tin trays or polished metal objects behind lamps to amplify light, creating makeshift illumination systems before widespread electric lighting became standard. Whether this was common practice or localized ingenuity, it reflects the adaptability of household working with limited resources. You shift slightly, and the shadows respond. It feels as though the room is alive in a quiet way, reacting to every small change in flame and movement. Outside, the storm intensifies again, and for a moment the sound becomes almost rhythmic, not chaotic, but patterned. Wind rises, holds, then drops, like a breathing system much larger than the house itself. You begin to understand why people in earlier eras often described weather in human terms. It behaves like something with presence. A subtle shift in atmosphere draws your attention back inward. The household is not silent. There are small, continuous signs of life. A cupboard opens and closes. A cloth is folded. Water is poured. These are not dramatic actions, but they are continuous proof of endurance. You imagine the family moving through these same motions day after day during storms like this, not in fear, but in routine. Routine becomes structure when everything outside is unstable. Another historical layer enters the moment. Agricultural communities in the 1930s often organized their daily schedules around environmental conditions rather than fixed clock times. Sunrise, daylight strength, wind patterns, and temperature influenced when work began and ended. Some historians note that this environmental timekeeping shaped rural perception of time itself, making it feel more fluid than in urban environments where industrial schedules dominated. There is ongoing discussion among scholars about how this influenced long-term cultural differences between rural and urban populations. You feel that fluidity now, Time here is not sharp, it stretches with warmth, compresses with cold, pauses during storms, and resumes when conditions allow. A sound from above interrupts your thoughts briefly. It is soft, likely a floorboard adjusting or someone shifting position. The upstairs of a farmhouse like this often holds bedrooms that retain cold more stubbornly than the kitchen below. Heat rises, but not evenly, and so the upper rooms exist in a different thermal reality. You imagine quilts layered thick onto beds, wool blankets pulled close, breath visible in the cold air above, while downstairs remains comparatively warm. That vertical division of temperature is a quiet but constant feature of older homes. The stove continues its steady presence. It is now fully established, a reliable centre. You realise that your attention returns to it instinctively whenever uncertainty rises. It has become an anchor point within the room. A faint smell shifts again, possibly from something simmering or warming. Food in this era is not just preparation. It is preservation of energy in edible form. Every meal is planned with future scarcity in mind. A small detail from rural life surfaces here. Many farm households kept what could be described as rotation-based food storage systems, where older preserved goods were used first to ensure nothing spoiled. This practical habit, sometimes referred to in agricultural studies as informal inventory rotation, reflects a level of resource awareness that modern storage systems often automate or conceal. You can sense that logic embedded in the kitchen. Nothing sits idle without purpose. Everything has timing outside. The blizzard continues to erase distance. Inside, the farmhouse continues to define it. One is expansion without structure. The other is structure resisting expansion. You stand between those two realities, aware that neither fully disappears, and when one cannot be seen. And in that awareness, the night continues to settle deeper into the house. The farmhouse feels different now, not because anything has changed suddenly, but because your attention has adjusted to its rhythm. You start to notice how every sound carries meaning in a place like this. The soft shift of wood, the distant settle of snow against the outer walls. Even the stove has its own language, a slow cycle of crack, breathe, and silence that repeats without hurry. You move slightly away from the kitchen centre, and the temperature difference becomes noticeable. Near the stove, the air feels alive. A few steps away, it turns cautious, thinner, less forgiving, in rural homes of the 1930s. This gradient of warmth was a normal part of winter living. Heat did not fill entire structures evenly, gathered in places and left others behind. A historical detail settles gently into the room. In many Depression-era farmhouses, insulation was minimal or improvised. Builders relied on thick timber, plaster, and sometimes newspaper stuffed into wall gaps to reduce drafts. There was no expectation of uniform comfort. Instead, households adapted by clustering life around heat sources. Some historians describe this as heat centering, a survival pattern shaped more by necessity than design. You glance toward the corners of the room, where shadows sit heavier. The lamplight does not fully reach them. It never could. Darkness is not just absence here, it is part of the architecture. A quiet movement somewhere in the house draws your attention upward again. The upstairs floorboards respond with a faint creak, like a slow breath being released. It is not alarming, it is familiar. Houses like this speak constantly in small structural adjustments, especially during storms when wind pressure shifts against outer walls. Outside, the blizzard has not weakened, if anything. It feels more methodical now. The wind does not rush so much as maintain a steady presence, pressing snow into new shapes across the unseen landscape. What was once a farmyard is now a continuous field of motionless white. You imagine the barn again, though it is no longer visible inside it. Animals would be shifting in their own rhythms, cattle adjusting weight, horses stamping occasionally to keep circulation moving. Rural life in 1936 depended heavily on livestock continuity through winter. Records from agricultural extensions of the time emphasized the importance of maintaining feed ratios carefully during storms to prevent losses that could carry financial consequences into the next planting season. You think about that chain of dependency. Weather affects feed, feed affects animals affect income affects survival. It's all connected in a loop that does not pause for convenience. A small sound from the stove interrupts your thoughts. A log shifts slightly inside, collapsing into glowing embers beneath it. The light inside the stove flares briefly, then settles again. This internal motion feels almost alive, as if the fire is constantly reorganizing itself to maintain balance. You notice how the family must constantly feed it. Not too much, not too little. Just enough to maintain stability. Fire here is not automatic, it is negotiated. A quirky detail from rural winter practices comes to mind. Some farm households reportedly use dampened cloth or carefully placed metal vents to control airflow in stoves more precisely, experimenting with small adjustments to stretch fuel supplies during long cold periods, whether widespread or anecdotal. These practices show how closely people observed flame behavior when resources were limited. You step closer again, drawn by the warmth. The kitchen feels like a boundary space between endurance and relief. It does not remove hardship, it simply makes it bearable for a while. On the table, you notice subtle traces of use. A faint ring where a cup once sat, knife marks that suggest repeated cutting in the same spot. These small details accumulate into a record of daily life. In historical studies of material culture, such wear patterns are often used to understand household routines in eras where written documentation is scarce. Scholars examining rural depression-era homes often show that objects become archives in their own right. A table is not just furniture, it is evidence. It records repetition more honestly than memory does. You let that idea settle for a moment. The kitchen is not just a space of survival, it is a space of accumulation, where time layers itself onto surfaces. Asking for permission. Another sound shifts your attention toward the window. The glass is now more opaque with frost. Ice patterns have thickened along the edges, forming branching shapes that spread slowly inward. They resemble natural diagrams, as if the cold is mapping its own version of the room from outside. A historical observation emerges here. During severe winters in the Midwest, frost formation on windows was a common feature in homes without modern ceiling. Some rural accounts describe families interpreting these patterns as indicators of temperature trends. Though modern science explains them as simple condensation and freezing processes influenced by airflow and glass imperfections, even so, the habit of observation became part of winter life. You find yourself staring at those patterns longer than expected. They shift slowly, almost imperceptibly, inside. The lamp continues its uneven glow, the flame bends, slightly with air movement, reshaping shadows across the walls. This kind of lighting creates a world that never fully stabilizes visually. Everything is always slightly in motion, even when still. You begin to feel how perception itself adjusts in this environment. Darkness is not uniform, light is not stable. Sound is layered, temperature is uneven. The farmhouse teaches you to interpret gradients rather than absolutes. A faint sense of isolation returns, but not sharply. It is more like awareness of scale. The world outside is vast and unresponsive, the world inside is small and active. Another historical layer enters quietly. Rural communities in the 1930s often relied heavily on informal communication networks during winter storms. Neighbours checked on each other when possible, but travel was limited in some regions. People used visual signals such as lantern placement, or smoke patterns to indicate safety or need. There is ongoing discussion among historians about how widespread these practices were versus how often they appear in localized accounts that may have been amplified through oral tradition. You imagine such signals briefly, though nothing outside now could be seen clearly enough to interpret them. The wind presses again against the house, and the structure responds with a slow groan, not a sign of weakness, but of adaptation. The farmhouse adjusts continuously, absorbing pressure and redistributing it through beams and joints that have already survived countless storms. You realize that endurance here is not dramatic, it is mechanical. It is repetition under stress. Inside the kitchen, the stove remains steady, the lamp flickers slightly, then steadies again. The table waits, the chairs remain in their places. Everything continues its quiet function without interruption. And in that continuity, the night deepens further, folding the farmhouse more tightly into itself as the blizzard outside continues its long, patient work. The farmhouse settles into a deeper kind of night now, the kind where time stops feeling linear and starts feeling layered. You're still in the kitchen, still close to the stove, but everything beyond that circle of warmth feels increasingly distant, as if the house has narrowed its own attention inward to survive the storm. The wind outside continues its steady pressure, but it no longer surprises you. Instead, it becomes part of the background rhythm. Like breathing, you no longer consciously notice. The snow is still building itself against the walls, reshaping the world outside without permission or pause. Inside, the lamp's glow shifts slightly as the flame adjusts to a faint draft. Shadows stretch across the ceiling, then contract again. In a house like this during the 1930s, light is never stable. It is something managed, not assumed. You hear a soft movement from somewhere deeper in the house. It is not urgent. It is routine. Someone is likely checking something again. Because in weather like this, repetition is reassurance, doors are tested twice, windows are pressed gently. The stove is observed as if it might decide to behave differently if ignored. A historical record from the era shows that rural households often developed extremely structured nightly routines during severe winters, especially in isolated farm regions. These routines were not written down formally, but passed through habit. Fire maintenance, animal checks, and food preservation all followed predictable cycles. This structure reduced uncertainty in environments where external conditions could not be controlled. You imagine that rhythm playing out here without needing to see it directly. The house itself feels trained by it. The stove gives a low pop again, a log shifting deeper into embers. Heat spreads outward in a slow pulse. You notice how the kitchen responds almost like an organism, adjusting its internal temperature in response to the fire's behaviour. A lesser-known rural habit was the practice of keeping fire-watching turns in some farm families during extreme weather, where one person would remain awake longer simply to ensure the stove did not burn too low overnight. It was not universal, but accounts from certain agricultural regions describe it as a practical response to fuel scarcity and freezing risks, whether widespread or not. It reflects how closely survival was tied to attention. You shift slightly in your place, and the floorboards respond with a soft creak. Even your smallest movements feel amplified in this quiet, as though the house is listening more closely now that the storm has taken over the outside world. The window draws your attention again. Frost patterns have thickened further, branching inward like pale roots spreading across glass. The outside is almost completely erased. There is no horizon anymore, only motionless whiteness pressing against transparency. You think about how perception changes when visibility disappears. In rural life during the 1930s, especially in winter storms, people often described losing their sense of distance entirely. Without landmarks, space becomes abstract. A few contemporary accounts from agricultural reports describe how even familiar farmyards could feel unfamiliar when fully covered in snow. Though interpretations vary on how psychologically disorienting this truly was versus how it is remembered in hindsight narratives, Here, from inside the kitchen, that disorientation is softened by warmth and structure. The stove becomes the anchor, the table becomes reference, the lamp becomes time. A faint sound rises from upstairs again. This time it lingers slightly longer before fading. The house is not silent, but it is careful with its noise. Cold amplifies everything outside. But inside it compresses sound into smaller, more intimate spaces. You imagine the upper rooms again. Beds layered with thick quilts, breath held close to blankets, the cold pressing gently through walls that were never fully insulated by modern standards. Sleep in such conditions was not uninterrupted, but it was habitual. People adapted by layering both clothing and bedding, creating microclimates of warmth within larger cold spaces. A historical observation drawn from rural life studies indicates that sleep patterns in farm households often adjusted seasonally, with longer periods of rest during winter months when daylight work was reduced. Some researchers interpret this as a form of environmental synchronization, while others suggest it was simply a practical response to limited heating resources. The debate remains open in historical literature, especially when comparing rural and urban sleep records from the same period. You feel that seasonal rhythm now in the way the house seems to slow itself down. Even thoughts feel less sharp here, as if the environment encourages softer focus. The stove's heat continues to define everything. You begin to notice how it subtly changes the behavior of objects nearby. Metal tools warm unevenly. Wooden surfaces expand slightly. Even the air feels denser close to it. A small domestic detail emerges in your awareness. In many farm kitchens of this era, cooking and heating were inseparable processes. Meals were often prepared in ways that maximize stove efficiency, using residual heat for simmering or warming rather than separate appliances. This practical integration of tasks shaped both diet and daily routine. You imagine food prepared slowly over this same stove, flavors developing not through precision but through time and necessity. Nothing here is rushed. Even nourishment follows the pace of fuel. Outside, the wind shifts again, but the farmhouse barely reacts now. It has already adapted to the storm's intensity. There is a kind of acceptance built into its structure, as if it knows what it can withstand and simply continues within that limit. You notice your own attention beginning to narrow, not in anxiety, but in focus. The kitchen becomes the entire world again. Stove, lamp, table, window, everything else fades into suggestion. A lesser-known rural observation from winter accounts describes how families often became highly attuned to subtle environmental changes during long storms, such as shifts in wind tone or the way snow pressed against windows. These small cues were used informally to estimate storm progression when no external information was available, whether consistently reliable or not, or they became part of lived experience. You can almost understand why, in a place like this, attention itself becomes a survival skill. The lamp flickers slightly, then steadies. The stove responds with another quiet crackle. The house continues its slow conversation with weather, a dialogue that requires no words, only endurance, and in that steady exchange. The night continues to deepen around the farmhouse, holding everything inside its small circle of heat and shadow. The kitchen has settled into a quieter rhythm now, the kind that happens when night deepens and the storm outside becomes less like an event and more like a condition of existence. You are still close to the stove, but your attention drifts toward the table, where the next part of life in this farmhouse unfolds in simple, practice movements. The cast iron pan that cooled earlier now sits slightly repositioned, as if someone has recently decided what to do with it next. Nothing here is wasted. Nothing is left uncertain for long. In 1936 rural households, especially during the Great Depression, food preparation was not just daily routine. It was careful planning stretched across weeks, sometimes months. with storage and rationing determining what appeared on the table. Contemporary records from agricultural extension offices describe how farm families relied heavily on preserved goods during winter months, including root vegetables, salted meats where available, and canned produce stored from summer harvests. Meals were often repetitive, but repetition was not failure. It was stability. In an environment where income and weather both fluctuated unpredictably, consistency in food became its own form of security. You move closer to the table, noticing how its surface carries the memory of countless meals. Knife marks, faint stains, worn grooves where bowls were set down repeatedly. This is not just furniture. It is a record of survival habits, written in wood rather than ink. A lesser-known rural habit was the practice of heat-staging meals, where families would time cooking steps to match stove cycles. Pots were placed in order of required heat intensity, with some dishes starting on high flame and others finishing in residual warmth. This method was not formally documented in many places, but appears in scattered oral histories from farming communities, reflecting how closely households adapted to fuel limitations. You imagine dinner here not as a single event, but as a sequence of adjustments. Nothing begins all at once. Everything is staggered according to fire and patience. Somewhere in the house, a cupboard opens. The sound is soft but deliberate. Glass jars likely shift inside, their contents carefully arranged. You can almost picture the shelves: beans, preserved fruit, maybe dried herbs tied in small bundles. Each item represents a moment from a different season, brought forward in time to this winter night. In rural life during this era, food storage was a central concern. Without modern refrigeration, families depended on cellar storage and canning techniques that had been refined over generations. Agricultural bulletins from the time emphasized the importance of airtight sealing and rotation systems to prevent spoilage during long winters. Some researchers suggest this constant awareness of food lifespan influenced broader household planning habits, extending even into budgeting and land use decisions. Though interpretations vary on how deeply this shaped long-term behavior, you notice how the kitchen reflects this logic. Nothing is decorative without purpose. Even simple objects seem chosen for endurance rather than appearance. The stove remains the heart of the process. Its heat is now less about survival and more about transformation. Something is likely simmering or warming nearby. The kind of slow cooking that defines Depression-era meals. Food here does not rush toward completion. It arrives gradually, shaped by time and necessity. A faint aroma begins to fill the room. It is subtle at first, then more noticeable. Root vegetables, perhaps, or broth stretched carefully to feed multiple people. In many rural households of the 1930s, meals were designed to maximize caloric efficiency while minimizing waste. Recipes were flexible by necessity, adjusted based on what was available rather than fixed instruction. You can feel how the table becomes the center of anticipation, not excitement in a modern sense, but readiness. People here do not gather for abundance, they gather for continuity. A historical observation drawn from rural studies indicates that communal eating in farm households often serve multiple functions beyond nutrition, including coordination of daily labor, sharing of weather observations, and informal financial discussion. Some scholars interpret this as evidence that the dinner table functioned as both social and operational hub, while others emphasize its emotional role as one of the few consistent gathering points in otherwise physically demanding lives. You imagine voices here, though none are loud. Conversations are likely short, practical, and grounded in immediate concerns. The storm outside would naturally dominate discussion. Roads, animals, temperature, fuel supply. Everything circles back to conditions beyond the walls. A faint movement of light shifts across the table as the lamp flickers slightly. Shadows stretch and then return. The instability of light continues to shape perception. In many farmhouses of this period, Lighting was limited to oil lamps or early battery-powered systems where available. Electricity, when present, was often restricted in use due to cost or inconsistent supply in rural regions. Historical accounts note that this uneven lighting influenced evening routines, often encouraging earlier rest and reduced activity after dark. You sit or imagine sitting at the table now, noticing how its surface absorbs light differently depending on the angle. It feels grounded, immovable, as if it has always been here and always will be. Another small rural detail emerges from memory accounts of the time. Some farm families reportedly kept a meal reserve corner of the table or nearby shelf where basic staples were always returned to after use, ensuring that even in exhaustion or distraction, essential supplies were never fully displaced. This informal organizational habit was less about discipline and more about reducing cognitive load during long winter periods when energy conservation mattered. Outside, the storm continues its steady pressure, but inside the kitchen, attention narrows again. Stove, table, lamp, and the faint movement of people preparing something simple and sustaining. You become aware of how sound behaves differently during mealtime preparation. Metal touching ceramic, water being poured, a spoon tapping lightly against the edge of a pot. Each sound feels amplified in the quiet, yet none of them feel disruptive. They belong here. A subtle historical layer settles into this moment. During the 1930s, rural diets were often shaped by regional agricultural production. Corn, potatoes, beans, and preserved meats formed the backbone of many meals in Midwestern farm households. Economic constraints and seasonal availability dictated variety more than preference. Some researchers suggest this dietary limitation influenced later public health initiatives focused on nutritional diversity, though interpretations of long-term effects remain debated in academic literature. You notice how the idea of enough replaces the idea of more in this space. Enough food, enough heat, enough light to function until morning. The table holds steady under this philosophy. It does not ask for excess. It simply supports what is placed upon it. A final detail settles into your awareness. The storm outside has not weakened, but it has become less intrusive in your perception. Not because it has changed, but because the kitchen has strengthened its internal focus. Heat, light, and routine form a small system of stability within a much larger environment of uncertainty. And as the meal continues to take shape through quiet, deliberate motion, the farmhouse holds its fragile balance between scarcity and sustenance, night and endurance, storm and shelter. The kitchen feels warmer now, not because the storm has eased, but because your attention has narrowed into what is immediately present. The stove, the table, the soft glow of the lamp, and the quiet sense that time is moving in slower, heavier layers. Outside, the blizzard continues its work. But here inside the farmhouse, something else begins to take shape in your awareness. Not isolation exactly, connection, stretched thin but still present. You notice it first in memory, or perhaps imagination shaped by what this place would have meant in 1936. Farms were not truly alone, even when they felt that way. Distance separated households, but necessity linked them in ways that modern life rarely demands. When storms like this closed roads and buried landmarks, the idea of neighbours shifted from proximity to obligation. Contemporary county records show that rural communities in the Midwest often relied on informal mutual aid during severe winter conditions in the 1930s. When travel became impossible, families prepared to support one another once conditions improved. Sharing feed, repairing equipment, or helping recover from storm damage. This system was not centrally organised. It emerged from repeated experience, where survival depended on cooperation more than competition. You imagine that network now, invisible under the snow, not roads, but expectations, not visible pathways, but social memory that says help will come when it can. The wind outside shifts again, pressing against the farmhouse in long, steady waves. It does not feel random anymore. It feels persistent, almost patient. Snow builds in places you cannot see, reshaping the land without sound. Inside, the stove continues its steady breathing. The kitchen holds its shape around it. You become aware of how much this space depends on continuity. Fire must be maintained, water must be warmed, light must be replenished. Everything here requires attention to remain functional. A lesser-known rural practice was the habit of marking storm check routines between neighbouring farms during winter seasons. Oral accounts from agricultural regions describe families agreeing informally on signals or expected intervals for checking in after storms passed. Sometimes it was as simple as smoke from chimneys, or a visible lantern placed in a window when conditions allowed. These were not formal system, but adaptive gestures shaped by necessity and trust. You think about how fragile those signals must have been in weather like this. A lantern could be hidden by snow glare. Smoke could be swallowed by wind. And yet people still relied on them, because absence of communication did not mean absence of care. The kitchen light flickers slightly, and shadows shift across the walls again. You notice how even small changes in flame affect perception here. The room is never visually stable. It is always adjusting, always rebalancing, somewhere in the house. A door closes softly. The sound is controlled, deliberate. Perhaps someone is checking the entryway again, making sure snow has not drifted too far inside, in rural homes during this era. Door maintenance during storms was routine. Snow accumulation could block exits quickly, if not managed carefully, especially when wind pushed drifts against exposed sides of buildings. You imagine someone opening the door briefly, feeling the immediate rush of cold air, and then closing it again quickly, leaving only a faint reminder of the outside world lingering in the threshold. There is ongoing historical discussion about how deeply isolation during severe weather shaped rural community identity during the Great Depression. Some interpretations suggest it strengthened interdependence and resilience, while others argue it reinforced hardship and emotional strain that was simply endured rather than resolved. Both perspectives appear in oral histories from the period, depending on region and individual experience. You stand in the middle of those interpretations now without needing to choose one. The farmhouse does not decide for you. It simply continues. Outside, the storm shows no sign of retreat. Instead, it seems to settle into endurance of its own, as if both house and weather are locked in parallel persistence. One resists entry, the other resists departure. A faint sound from the stove draws your attention again. Another log shifts, settling deeper into embers. Heat expands outward in a soft pulse. You begin to recognize how the stove regulates not just temperature but mood. When it is steady, the house feels steady. When it weakens, everything feels more uncertain. A small rural habit surfaces in memory accounts from winter farming life. Some households reportedly kept a designated storm chair near the stove, always placed in the warmest position, reserved for whoever needed rest most during long cold nights. It was not a formal rule, but an adaptive comfort strategy that emerged in many isolated homes where warmth was limited and shared deliberately. You look at the chairs around the kitchen more closely now. None are identical in placement. Each seems slightly adjusted, as if responding to invisible needs. The table remains central, its surface reflecting dim lamplight in uneven patterns. You notice how its imperfections have become familiar rather than distracting. Scratches, dents, and faded marks all contribute to its presence. In material studies of rural homes, such wear is often interpreted as a visual record of repeated use over years of constrained resources, where replacement was rare and repair was preferred. You run your attention across those marks and imagine the accumulation of seasons behind them. Summers of harvest preparation, autumns of storage, winters like this one. Pressing inward, outside, the wind changes pitch slightly, and for a moment the farmhouse responds with a subtle groan. Not instability, but adjustment. the structure flexes in small ways, distributing pressure through beams and joints that have long since learned how to endure. You begin to sense how everything here is shaped by repetition, not dramatic events, but cycles: fire, food, weather, rest. Each one returns without surprise. A faint warmth spreads through the kitchen as the stove reaches another steady phase. The lamp remains uneven but reliable enough to continue shaping the room. The sense of isolation is still present, but it is softened by routine. Even in a sealed winter night, life continues in small, consistent motions. Academic interpretations of rural Depression-era living often emphasize this duality. Some researchers highlight adaptability and communal reliance as defining traits, while others focus on the psychological weight of prolonged uncertainty in environments where external conditions could dominate daily life. The discussion remains active, shaped by new readings of oral histories and regional records. You feel both interpretations at once without needing to resolve them. The kitchen does not demand resolution. It only asks for presence, outside. The snow continues to build its quiet architecture across the land. Inside, the farmhouse continues its slower, warmer resistance. And in between those two forces, you remain in a space where survival is not a moment, but a continuous practice carried forward 1 hour at a time. The kitchen has now become something more than a room. It feels like a contained world, sealed against everything outside except the sound of it. The blizzard is still present, still pressing, but it no longer dominates your attention. Instead, your focus shifts to the subtle architecture of survival that has formed around you. Stove, table, lamp, walls, breath, walls. You notice how the farmhouse organizes itself around heat. Everything leans toward the stove, not physically, but conceptually, even stand. Feels warmer near it. In 1936 rural farmhouses, this centralization of warmth was not accidental. It was a direct response to construction limitations and fuel scarcity. Heating entire buildings evenly was rarely possible, so life adapted to heat concentration rather than distribution. Records from agricultural housing surveys of the era show that many farm homes relied on a single primary heat source, often a wood or coal stove placed in the kitchen. This room became the de facto living space during winter months. Cooking, eating, working, and resting all converged here because it was the only reliably warm area in the house. You can feel that convergence now. The kitchen is not just where life happens, it is where life is allowed to continue. A faint sound rises from somewhere above, a slow creak that lingers longer than usual. The upstairs rooms are colder, always colder, and that difference creates its own kind of separation. Heat rises, but unevenly, leaving upper spaces to exist in a quieter, more withdrawn state. In many rural homes of this period, bedrooms were used primarily for sleeping and little else during winter, because prolonged exposure to cold interiors made extended activity impractical. You imagine blankets layered thick, breath visible in dim light, and the instinct to conserve body heat by stillness rather than movement. Sleep in such environments was often segmented, interrupted by temperature shifts or the need to tend fires below. A lesser-known rural practice was the habit of rotating sleeping positions within a household during severe cold spells, where individuals would take turns resting closest to heat sources on particularly harsh nights. This was not formalized, but appears in scattered oral accounts from farming regions where resource conservation extended even into rest. You shift slightly in your own awareness of the room, noticing how proximity to the stove defines comfort zones with surprising precision. A few steps closer means warmth that feels almost complete. A few steps away and the air turns cautious again. The lamp flickers, and shadows respond immediately. Light here is not stable illumination, it is negotiation. Every movement of flame changes the structure of the room. This instability was common in rural homes of the 1930s, where oil lamps or early battery systems provided limited and uneven lighting. Historical housing studies note that such lighting conditions often influenced evening routines, encouraging quieter activity and earlier rest, especially during winter months when daylight hours were already reduced. You begin to notice how the farmhouse encourages stillness without demanding it. It simply makes motion less necessary. Outside, the wind continues its layered motion, sometimes steady, sometimes shifting in tone. Snow accumulates in unseen patterns, reshaping the land without reference points. There is no road now in any meaningful sense, only continuity of white. Some rural accounts from the period describe how families often lost track of familiar landmarks during prolonged storms. Not because they disappeared instantly, but because gradual accumulation erased distinguishing features over time. Fences, paths, even garden edges would dissolve into uniform surfaces. This slow erasure created a kind of spatial uncertainty that was managed through memory and routine rather than visual confirmation. You feel that idea subtly reflected in the kitchen itself. Everything here is known by use, not by appearance. You do not need to see every detail to understand its purpose. The stove emits another soft sound as embers settle deeper. Heat expands outward again, filling the room with a steady consistency. You notice how this consistency shapes perception of time. Without fluctuating temperature or changing light, time becomes less segmented. It stretches. A small rural observation appears in historical accounts of winter farm life. Some families reportedly developed informal fire pacing, where stove maintenance followed predictable intervals to conserve fuel. Logs were added in measured cycles rather than continuously, creating a rhythm that structured nighttime activity, whether widespread or localized. This practice reflects how closely resource management shaped daily patterns. You can almost sense that rhythm now, even without counting it. Heat rises, settles, renews. Somewhere in the house, a faint sound suggests movement again, not urgent, just present. Houses like this often feel inhabited even in silence, because materials respond to environment. Wood shifts with temperature, nails adjust under pressure. The structure itself becomes expressive in cold weather. There is ongoing historical interpretation about how rural households psychologically adapted to prolonged winter confinement during the Great Depression. Some researchers emphasize resilience through routine, noting that predictable daily structures reduce stress in uncertain environments. Others suggest that extended isolation intensified awareness of environmental conditions, making families more attuned to subtle changes in weather and sound. Both perspectives draw from oral histories, which vary widely by region and personal experience. You stand within that complexity without needing to resolve it. The kitchen remains unchanged regardless of interpretation. A faint smell drifts through the air again, tied to food preparation or residual heat. It reminds you that nourishment here is always gradual. Nothing is instant. Meals are not events, but processes unfolding alongside fire and time. You glance at the table again. It continues to act as anchor for everything that happens in this room. Its surface reflects years of use in ways that feel almost geological. Layers of activity compressed into visible texture. A lesser-known domestic habit from rural households involved keeping certain utensils permanently near the stove, not because of convenience alone, but because movement between storage areas and heat sources was minimized during cold months. This spatial efficiency reduced exposure to drafts and conserved energy, both human and fuel-based. You begin to see the kitchen as a system rather than a space. Every object has a logic shaped by survival conditions. Outside, the storm persists without variation. Inside, variation exists only in small adjustments of flame and shadow. The farmhouse continues to hold its balance between pressure and warmth. And in that balance, Night continues unfolding without urgency. The night has deepened further now, but inside the farmhouse the sense of time no longer feels strictly tied to darkness. It feels layered, as if each hour sits gently on top of the last rather than replacing it. You remain in the kitchen, though your awareness begins to extend outward into the rest of the house again, following faint sounds and subtle shifts in temperature. The stove continues its steady work, its heat now so familiar that you almost stop consciously noticing it. That is when it becomes most important. In rural 1936 farm life, steady heat was not taken for granted. It was actively maintained, monitored and respected. A fire that went out overnight could mean frozen water lines, spoiled food, and a harsh restart in the morning cold. So even when the stove feels passive, it is still central to everything. A rural housing report from the era notes that kitchen stoves in isolated farmhouses often functioned as multi-purpose systems, providing heat, cooking capacity, and sometimes even a way to warm water for washing in the absence of separate plumbing systems. This integration of functions shaped daily routines in ways that modern readers often underestimate. One object did the work of many, and its failure affected everything at once. You shift slightly, and the floor responds with a soft creak. The house is not silent, but its sounds are restrained, as if even noise conserves energy here. Upstairs, another faint adjustment echoes through the beams, likely caused by temperature differences between levels. Cold air holds more stubbornly in upper rooms, while the kitchen remains the thermal centre. You begin to imagine the rest of the house in more detail. The narrow hallway leading away from the kitchen, the stairs that rise with uneven spacing, the upstairs rooms that likely hold beds, trunks, and folded clothing, all arranged for practicality rather than comfort. In many farmhouses of this period, upper floors were used primarily for sleeping, while most daily activity remained downstairs where heat was concentrated. A lesser-known rural practice was the use of shared bedding systems during severe winter nights, where multiple blankets and quilts were rotated throughout the household to retain warmth efficiently. Oral accounts from agricultural regions describe families layering bedding in ways that maximized insulation, sometimes combining homemade quilts with older wool blankets passed down through generations, whether universal or not. This reflects the constant adaptation to cold environments. Outside, the storm remains consistent. It does not escalate or retreat. It simply continues, as if it has found its own rhythm against the house. Snow builds silently in unseen drifts, reshaping everything without reference to memory or structure. You think about how disorienting that must be from the outside, without landmarks, without horizon. Even familiar ground becomes abstract. Some rural accounts from winter storms in the 1930s describe travellers losing their sense of direction within short distances from home, not because they were far away, but because visual reference points disappeared entirely. Fields, fences, and paths blended into uniform white surfaces. Inside the kitchen, that disorientation is held at bay by repetition. Stove, lamp, table, each object is fixed in place, reinforcing orientation through familiarity. The lamp flickers slightly again, and shadows respond across the walls. The movement is subtle but constant. Light here does not stabilize the room so much as continuously redraw it. In rural homes of this era, this kind of lighting was common during winter months when daylight was limited, and electricity, if available, was often conserved. The result was an environment where perception shifted gently throughout the evening rather than remaining fixed. You notice how this affects attention. Nothing stays visually static long enough to be ignored completely. Even stillness carries motion. A faint sound from the stove draws you back again. Another log has shifted inward. Settling into embers, the glow brightens briefly, then softens. Heat radiates outward in slow waves. You begin to understand how deeply this rhythm shapes everything in the house. Even without clocks or external cues, the stove provides a form of temporal structure. Feed, wait, adjust, repeat, must. A rural observation from agricultural life studies notes that households often developed intuitive timing systems based on stove cycles. People learn to associate fire intensity with daily phases such as preparation, eating, and rest. This informal synchronization between human activity and heat source created a kind of environmental clock that replaced mechanical timekeeping in many situations. You feel that rhythm now without needing to measure it. Somewhere deeper in the house, there is a faint rustle of movement again, not disruptive, but continuous. The farmhouse never feels empty, even when quiet. It carries the presence of activity through small residual sounds. Wood contracting, fabric shifting, air moving through imperfect seals. There is ongoing historical discussion about how rural winter isolation affected perception of sound and space in farm households. Some researchers suggest that prolonged exposure to limited sensory environments heightened awareness of subtle auditory changes, while others argue that familiarity simply made these sounds more noticeable over time. Oral histories from the period often describe both heightened sensitivity and comforting familiarity, depending on context. You are experiencing something similar now. Every sound feels both ordinary and significant at once. The kitchen itself feels slightly smaller now, not physically, but perceptually. Warmth compresses attention inward. The stove defines a central boundary around which everything else organizes itself. Even the table feels closer to it than before, as if drawn into its gravitational presence. A lesser-known domestic habit from rural households was the practice of repositioning seating during winter months to optimize heat exposure. Chairs were moved closer to stoves in predictable patterns depending on time of day and activity. This flexible arrangement of space reflects how interior layouts were not fixed but seasonal, adapting continuously to environmental conditions. You imagine chairs being nudged slightly, not dramatically, but enough to remain within comfortable warmth zones. Outside, the wind continues its steady presence, but it no longer demands interpretation. It is simply there, shaping the outer boundary of everything inside. The farmhouse continues its quieter logic. Heat, light, structure, repetition, and in that continuity, the night moves forward without interruption, holding everything within its steady, enclosed rhythm. The farmhouse settles into a deeper stillness now, but it is not empty stillness. It is the kind shaped by endurance. By hours of weather pressing steadily against structure while life continues carefully inside, you remain in the kitchen, though your awareness begins to drift between spaces, as if the house itself is gently expanding in your mind even as it remains physically unchanged. The stove continues to anchor everything. Its heat has become so steady that it feels less like an event and more like an atmosphere. In 1936 rural households, this kind of sustained warmth was not accidental. It required constant attention, careful fuel management, and an understanding of how to stretch heat output across long winter nights. Records from agricultural life studies indicate that families often planned their entire evening schedules around maintaining consistent stove performance, especially during severe weather. You notice how that idea reshapes your sense of time here. Nothing is rushed, nothing is paused, everything is adjusted. A faint creak moves through the ceiling again, slower this time, almost like the house is exhaling. Upper rooms remain colder, and that temperature difference creates a subtle vertical tension within the structure. Heat gathers below, cold settles above. In many rural farmhouses of this period, this stratification of temperature was a defining feature of winter living conditions. People adapted to it without expecting uniform comfort. You imagine the upstairs rooms again? Now more clearly. Beds layered with quilts, trunks at the foot of beds, clothing folded in anticipation of another cold morning. In some rural accounts from the era, families describe sleeping in heavier garments during winter months, not out of discomfort but practicality. The environment required adaptation even during rest. A lesser-known rural practice was the use of shared warming methods before sleep, such as heated stones wrapped in cloth or metal containers filled with hot water placed near bedding. These improvised solutions appear in scattered oral histories from farming communities and reflect the constant effort to retain warmth in poorly insulated environments. You shift slightly near the stove, feeling how the heat defines invisible boundaries around you. Step too far away and the air changes quickly. Step closer and everything softens again. Outside, the storm continues without variation. Snow does not fall so much as accumulate in layers that erase distinction. The world beyond the window is no longer a landscape but a continuous surface of motionless brightness. There are no edges left to interpret. Some rural reports from the 1930s describe how prolonged snow cover could alter perception of distance, making familiar structures appear closer or farther than they were. Without contrast, depth becomes uncertain. This effect is not just visual but cognitive. As the brain attempts to reconstruct missing spatial cues, interpretations vary among researchers about how significantly this influenced rural navigation during extended winter storms. From inside the kitchen, that uncertainty is held at a distance. The stove, the table, and the lamp create reference points that stabilize perception. The lamp flickers again, briefly altering the shape of the room. Shadows stretch across the walls, then settle back. Light here does not define space evenly, it reveals it in fragments. In rural homes of this era, lighting was often limited to single sources in main rooms, especially during winter when fuel or electricity was conserved. This created environments where visibility was always partial, never complete. You begin to understand how that affects attention. Nothing can be seen all at once. Everything is experienced in layers. A faint sound from deeper within the house suggests movement again, though it is indistinct. It could be someone shifting position, or simply the structure responding to temperature changes. Wooden buildings in cold climates are rarely silent for long, they adjust continuously, expanding and contracting in response to environmental pressure. There is ongoing historical interpretation about how rural households psychologically experience these long winter nights. Some researchers emphasize the role of routine as a stabilizing force, suggesting that repeated daily patterns helped reduce uncertainty. Others highlight the emotional weight of confinement and limited external interaction, noting that oral histories often contain both expressions of resilience and quiet strain. The evidence does not point to a single interpretation, but rather a spectrum of lived experiences. You stand in that spectrum now without needing to choose a side. The kitchen simply continues to function regardless of interpretation. A small shift in the stove sound draws your attention. Another log settles, releasing a brief glow before dimming into embers. Heat pulses outward again, steady and controlled. You begin to recognize how deeply this rhythm structures everything in the house. Even without formal timekeeping, the stove provides a continuous cycle that guides activity and rest. A lesser-known domestic habit was the practice of aligning household tasks with fire maintenance cycles. People would prepare food, wash utensils, or complete small repairs in the intervals between fuel adjustments, using the natural rhythm of the stove as an organizing framework. This created a subtle synchronization between labor and heat. You can almost feel that rhythm embedded in the kitchen itself. Nothing happens randomly. Everything follows an internal logic shaped by warmth. Outside, the wind shifts slightly and the farmhouse responds with a slow, almost imperceptible adjustment. Not resistance, but accommodation. The structure is not fighting the storm. It is distributing its pressure across beams and joints that have long since learned how to hold. You notice how your attention begins to soften again, not from fatigue alone, but from the environment encouraging a narrower focus. Stove, lamp, table, everything else recedes. A faint smell lingers in the air, tied to food or heat or both. It is not strong, but persistent. In rural kitchens of the 1930s, smells often lingered due to limited ventilation during winter months. Windows remained closed to preserve heat, which meant that cooking aromas and smoke traces accumulated in interior spaces. This accumulation contributes to the sense of continuity here. Nothing resets, everything carries forward. Another subtle rural observation appears in historical accounts of winter living. Some families developed informal heat-sharing habits, where activities that generated warmth, such as cooking or washing, were deliberately timed to benefit multiple household needs at once. This reflects a broader pattern of resource optimization in environments where energy was limited. You realize that even comfort here is coordinated. It's not spontaneous, it is arranged. The kitchen remains steady in its glow. The storm remains steady in its pressure. And between those two constants, the farmhouse continues its quiet negotiation with night, holding its internal balance one moment at a time. The farmhouse has now fully entered that deep winter stillness, where time feels less like a sequence and more like a presence. You remain in the kitchen, but your awareness has softened outward, as if the house is gently widening its boundaries in your mind while staying physically unchanged. The stove continues its steady pulse, and everything in the room subtly orients itself around that warmth. Outside, the blizzard still moves, though it no longer feels like an event with a beginning or end. It is simply there, persistent and unbroken, pressing against the world without urgency. Snow continues to build in invisible layers, reshaping the landscape beyond recognition. Inside, the kitchen holds its structure with quiet certainty. You notice how every object feels slightly more meaningful now. The table is not just wood, it is repetition made visible. The lamp is not just light, it is time measured in flickers. The stove is not just heat, it is continuity. You shift your attention toward the soundscape of the house. It is subtle, but constant. The faint movement of air through small gaps in the structure, the occasional settling of wood, the distant suggestion of movement upstairs. None of it is alarming, all of it is familiar. In rural farmhouses of the 1930s, especially during winter confinement, this kind of acoustic environment was normal. Buildings built with timber and basic insulation responded continuously to temperature changes, producing a kind of living sound profile that inhabitants grew accustomed to over time. A historical record from rural housing studies describes how these structures were rarely silent. Expansion and contraction of wood, wind pressure against outer walls, and uneven heating created ongoing micro sounds throughout the day and night. People learned to interpret these sounds as part of household life rather than disturbances. You begin to realize how deeply the house communicates without language. The stove gives a low, steady pop again as another piece of wood settles. Heat spreads outward in soft waves. The kitchen briefly feels slightly warmer, then returns to equilibrium. This rhythm is now so familiar that it almost disappears into background awareness until it changes. A rural observation from agricultural life accounts notes that households often developed informal timing instincts based on stove behavior, without clocks being the primary reference during long winter nights. People sometimes gauged time by fuel cycles, fire intensity, and the need for adjustment. This created an embodied sense of duration rather than a strictly measured one. You feel that shift now is no longer segmented. It is continuous, shaped by warmth and attention. A faint movement from upstairs returns, slightly more pronounced this time. The sound travels through the beams and settles into the kitchen like a reminder that the house has vertical depth. Upper rooms remain colder, and that temperature difference creates a natural separation between levels of the home. In many rural farmhouses during this era, Upstairs spaces were used primarily for sleeping, while daily activity remained concentrated below where heat was strongest. You imagine those upper rooms again. Still air, thick blankets, the slow condensation of breath in colder corners. Sleep in such conditions was not uniform or uninterrupted. It adjusted to environmental pressure, often lightening during extreme cold periods when the body remained partially alert to temperature changes. Some rural accounts describe families shifting sleeping arrangements seasonally, moving closer together during winter months to conserve warmth. This practice appears in oral histories from farming regions, though its exact prevalence varies by location and household structure. You notice how even rest here is shaped by efficiency. The lamp flickers slightly, and the room changes shape again. Shadows stretch across the ceiling, then settle back. Light in this environment is never static. It constantly redraws the boundaries of visibility. In rural homes of the 1930s, oil lamps or early battery lighting systems were the primary sources of evening illumination. Their limited reach created spaces of partial visibility where objects were known more by position than by full clarity. You begin to understand how this affects perception. Nothing is ever fully revealed at once. Everything is experienced in fragments. Outside, the storm continues without variation. There is no indication of change in intensity or direction. It simply persists, shaping the exterior world into uniformity. Snow accumulation continues silently, erasing distinctions between ground, fence, and field. Some agricultural reports from the period describe how extended snow cover could disrupt spatial awareness in rural environments. Without visual markers, distance perception becomes unreliable. Familiar landscapes lose definition. Interpretations in historical research vary on how strongly this influenced daily rural movement. But there is agreement that prolonged storms significantly altered how people experienced their surroundings. From inside the kitchen, that distortion feels distant. The stove, table, and lamp provide stable reference points that anchor perception. A faint smell drifts again through the room, likely from residual cooking or stored food warming nearby. In rural kitchens of this era, smells often lingered longer due to closed windows and limited ventilation during winter. Heat retention was prioritized over air exchange, creating interior environments where sensory impressions accumulated over time. You begin to notice how this accumulation contributes to the feeling of continuity. Nothing resets fully. Everything carries forward. A lesser-known domestic habit from rural households involved positioning frequently used items within immediate reach of the stove during winter months. This minimized unnecessary movement across colder areas of the house and reduced exposure to drafts. It was not formally structured, but emerged naturally from repeated seasonal experience. You can almost see that logic reflected in the kitchen layout. Everything essential seems slightly closer to warmth than necessity alone would require. The stove continues its slow cycle of adjustment. Another log settles deeper into embers, releasing a brief glow before fading. Heat expands outward again, steady and controlled. This repetition now feels like the underlying structure of the entire house. There is ongoing historical interpretation regarding how rural families psychologically experienced extended winter isolation during the Great Depression. Some researchers emphasize routine as a stabilizing framework that provided predictability in uncertain environments. Others highlight the emotional complexity of confinement, noting that oral histories often contain both descriptions of hardship and accounts of quiet stability depending on context and region. The evidence supports multiple interpretations rather than a single conclusion. You remain within that complexity without needing to resolve it. The kitchen continues regardless. Outside, the wind shifts slightly, and the farmhouse adjusts with it, not resisting but responding. The structure distributes pressure through its frame in ways that have been refined over decades of exposure to seasonal extremes. Inside, Warmth continues to define the space, light continues to shape perception, and time continues to move without clear boundaries, held together by repetition rather than measurement. The night deepens further, folding the farmhouse into its steady winter rhythm. The farmhouse feels even quieter now, though it is not silence you are experiencing, it is refinement of sound, where only the most persistent elements remain audible. The stove continues its slow-breathing rhythm, and the lamp maintains its uneven glow. But everything else seems softened, as if the storm outside has pressed a layer of insulation over the entire world. You remain in the kitchen, though your awareness is no longer fixed in one place. It drifts through the structure of the house, following faint vibrations in the floorboards, the ceiling beams, and the walls. In a 1936 rural farmhouse, especially during severe winter conditions, the house itself becomes an active participant in daily life. It responds to temperature shifts, wind pressure, and internal heat in continuous micro-adjustments. Construction records and rural housing surveys from the era indicate that many farmhouses were built with timber framing and limited insulation materials, often relying on newspaper, cloth scraps, or sawdust packed into wall gaps to reduce drafts. These methods were practical rather than standardized, varying from household to household depending on resources and local knowledge. You begin to feel those variations now, not as defects, but as personality. Every farmhouse of this period carries its own pattern of sound and response. A faint creak travels through the ceiling again, slower this time, almost rhythmic. The upper floor remains colder, and the vertical temperature divide creates a subtle sense of two separate environments within the same structure. In many rural homes during this period, upstairs rooms were used primarily for sleeping, while all other activity was concentrated downstairs where heat was available. This separation was not formal but functional, shaped entirely by environmental necessity. You imagine those upper rooms once more, still, dim, and slightly withdrawn from the warmth below. Beds layered thick with quilts, clothing folded carefully, the air cooler but stubble. Sleep in such spaces was often described in rural accounts as lighter during extreme cold, with frequent awareness of temperature changes influencing rest patterns. A lesser-known rural practice was the use of shared warming routines before sleep, where families would briefly gather near heat sources before dispersing to colder rooms, maximizing the body's retained warmth. These practices appear in scattered oral histories from agricultural regions, reflecting adaptation rather than comfort. You shift slightly into your place near the stove, noticing again how sharply warmth defines space. A step closer changes everything. A step away returns the cold in gradual but noticeable layers. The stove itself continues to regulate the room's atmosphere. Each log shift, each small collapse of embers, produces subtle changes in heat distribution. In rural households of the 1930s, this kind of stove management was essential. Fuel efficiency determined not just comfort but survival during prolonged storms. A rural housing analysis from the period notes that kitchens were often designed or modified over time to maximize stove efficiency. Placement of furniture, cooking tools, and storage items frequently evolved based on proximity to heat rather than aesthetic considerations. This created interiors shaped by the environmental logic rather than formal design. You can see that logic reflected here. Everything in the kitchen appears positioned with intention born from repetition. Outside, the storm remains unchanged in intensity. Snow continues to accumulate in layers that erase any remaining definition of the landscape. The world beyond the window has become a continuous field of white motion, lacking reference points or boundaries. Some rural accounts from winter storms in the 1930s describe how prolonged snowfall could alter perception of distance and orientation. Without visible markers, familiar surroundings became abstract, and movement outdoors required reliance on memory and tactile guidance rather than sight. Interpretations among researchers differ on how psychologically disorienting this experience was, but there is agreement that it significantly affected rural mobility during extended storms. From inside the kitchen, that disorientation is contained. The stove, table, and lamp act as anchors that maintain spatial certainty. The lamp flickers again, and the room shifts slightly in response. Shadows stretch and compress across walls and ceiling. Light in this environment is never fixed. It continuously redefines the shape of the space. In rural homes of this period, lighting sources were limited and often inconsistent, especially during winter months when fuel conservation was necessary. This created interiors where visibility changed subtly over time rather than remaining constant. You begin to notice how this affects perception of objects. Nothing is fully stable in appearance. Everything exists in a state of gentle visual transition. A faint sound from elsewhere in the house suggests movement again, though it is indistinct. It could be structural adjustment or someone shifting position. Timber houses respond continuously to environmental conditions, producing a range of subtle noises that become part of the lived soundscape. There is ongoing historical interpretation regarding how rural households experienced extended winter isolation during the Great Depression. Some researchers emphasize the stabilizing role of routine in maintaining psychological equilibrium, while others highlight the emotional complexity of confinement under resource pressure. Oral histories from the period often reflect both perspectives depending on individual circumstances, region, and family structure. You remain within that duality without needing to resolve it. The kitchen continues its function regardless of interpretation. A small shift in the stove sound draws attention again. Another piece of wood settles into embers, producing a brief glow before fading into steady heat. This repetition forms a rhythm that now feels almost like timekeeping itself. A lesser-known domestic habit in rural households involved aligning household tasks with stove cycles. Activities such as cooking, cleaning, and minor repairs were often timed to coincide with periods of stable heat output, minimizing fuel waste and maximizing efficiency. This created an informal synchronization between labor and environmental conditions. You can feel that synchronization embedded in the atmosphere of the kitchen. Outside, the wind shifts slightly, and the farmhouse responds with a slow structural adjustment. Not resistance, but accommodation. The building redistributes pressure through its frame, a process refined over years of seasonal exposure. Inside, the stove continues its steady warmth. The lamp continues its uneven illumination. The table remains fixed, absorbing the presence of repeated use. Time here does not advance sharply. It accumulates gently, shaped by repetition rather than markers. And in that accumulation, the farmhouse holds its steady balance between storm and shelter, night and warmth, isolation and continuity. The night feels heavier now, not in a threatening way, but in a deepening way. As if the farmhouse has settled further into itself. You are still in the kitchen, still within the reach of the stove's warmth, but your awareness stretches farther into the house than before. Every sound seems slightly more defined, every shift of wood or air more noticeable, as if the structure has become more transparent to perception. The stove remains steady, its glow constant and dependable. In rural 1936 farmhouses, that steadiness was not automatic, it was the result of constant attention, careful fuel use, and an understanding of how fire behaved over long winter nights. Agricultural extension reports from the era describe how families often developed informal expertise in fire management. Learning how to balance airflow, fuel type, and timing to maintain consistent heat with limited resources. You can feel that expertise embedded in the rhythm of the room. The stove is not just producing warmth, it is regulating the entire environment. A faint creak travels through the walls again, slightly lower in tone this time. The house responds to temperature differences like a living structure. Timber expands and contracts, joints adjust, and nails shift subtly within aged wood. In rural housing studies of the 1930s, these sounds were commonly noted as part of winter living conditions, especially in regions with strong seasonal temperature swings. You begin to understand how normal this becomes for those who lived here. The house is never entirely still. It is always negotiating with cold. Upstairs, another sound emerges, softer and more prolonged. It fades slowly into silence. The upper level remains significantly colder, creating a natural separation of experience within the same building. In many farmhouses of this period, upstairs rooms were used almost exclusively for sleeping during winter months, while daily activity remained concentrated downstairs. This arrangement was not formal design but environmental adaptation. You imagine those upstairs rooms again. Still air, heavier blankets, breath visible in the dim light before sleep. In rural accounts from the period, people often described winter sleep as lighter and more responsive to environmental changes. With frequent partial waking during cold shifts or wind surges, a lesser-known rural practice was the use of layered sleeping arrangements where bedding was rotated throughout the household to maximize retained warmth. Families sometimes shared quilts or repositioned blankets during the night to conserve heat more efficiently. These habits appear in scattered oral histories and reflect practical adaptation to limited heating capacity. You shift slightly near the stove, noticing again how sharply warmth defines spatial boundaries. The difference between comfort and cold is measured in only a few steps. The lamp flickers again, briefly altering the shape of the kitchen. Shadows stretch across the ceiling and then contract. Light here is not stable illumination, but continuous adjustment. In rural households of the 1930s, lighting systems were often limited to oil lamps or early battery-powered fixtures, depending on availability. Electricity, where present, was not always reliable or used continuously due to cost considerations. This created environments where visibility changed subtly throughout the evening. Objects were not seen in fixed clarity but in shifting partial views. You begin to notice how this affects perception. Familiar items do not feel entirely static. They feel slightly reinterpreted with each change in light. Outside, the storm continues its uninterrupted presence. Snow accumulates silently, erasing boundaries and reshaping the land into uniform whiteness. The world beyond the window has lost nearly all distinguishing features. There is no horizon, no road, no clear separation between ground and sky. Some rural accounts from severe winter events in the 1930s describe how prolonged snow covers could disrupt spatial awareness, making familiar surroundings difficult to interpret visually. Without contrast, depth perception becomes unreliable. Interpretations among researchers differ on how psychologically significant this effect was, but there is general agreement that it altered how rural inhabitants experienced outdoor space during extended storms. From inside the kitchen, that uncertainty is held at distance. The stove, table, and lamp provide reference points that stabilize perception. A faint sound shifts again through the house. It is indistinct but present, likely structural adjustment responding to wind pressure or temperature change. Timber buildings in cold climates rarely remain acoustically neutral. They respond continuously to environmental forces, producing a layered soundscape that becomes part of daily life. There is ongoing historical interpretation regarding how rural families experienced extended winter confinement during the Great Depression. Some researchers emphasize the role of routine in creating psychological stability under uncertain conditions, while others highlight the emotional complexity of prolonged isolation and resource limitation. Oral histories reflect both perspectives, often within the same accounts, suggesting that lived experience varied widely across households and regions. You remain within that range of interpretation without needing to define it. The kitchen continues regardless of explanation. The stove gives another soft adjustment as embers shift deeper. Heat pulses outward in a slow, steady wave. This repetition has now become a form of time awareness. Without clocks or external markers, the stove's cycles structure the evening. A lesser-known domestic habit from rural household involved aligning daily activities with stove maintenance cycles. Cooking, cleaning, and preparation tasks were often organized around moments when the fire required attention or adjustment. This created a natural rhythm that linked labor directly to environmental conditions. You can feel that rhythm embedded in the kitchen's atmosphere. The table remains central, its surface marked by repeated use over time. These marks are not decorative but functional records of activity. Material culture studies of rural households often interpret such wear as evidence of long-term adaptation, where objects are maintained and reused rather than replaced. You begin to see the table not as furniture but as continuity made visible. Outside, the wind shifts slightly, and the farmhouse responds with a slow, almost imperceptible adjustment. Not resistance, but accommodation. The structure distributes pressure across its frame in a pattern refined through years of seasonal exposure. Inside, warmth remains steady. Light remains uneven but constant in presence. Time continues its slow accumulation without clear division. The night deepens further, holding the farmhouse within its enclosed rhythm of heat, structure, and quiet persistence. The farmhouse now feels like it has fully surrendered to the rhythm of the night, not in defeat, but in acceptance. Everything inside has adjusted to a quieter mode of existence. You are still in the kitchen, still within the circle of warmth created by the stove, but your awareness has expanded slightly outward again, tracing the invisible structure of the house as it responds to the storm outside. The wind continues its steady pressure, but it no longer feels unpredictable. It has become a constant presence, like a distant engine that never turns off. Snow builds outside in layers that no longer resemble individual flakes, but instead form a continuous accumulation that reshapes the world without sound. Inside, the stove remains the heart of everything. Its heat is consistent now, requiring less adjustment than earlier in the evening. In rural farmhouses of the 1930s, this kind of stability was the result of experience rather than design. Surviving winter nights required an intuitive understanding of fuel consumption and airflow regulation. Skills developed over years of repetition. Surviving agricultural reports from the period of how households often measured their evening routines around stove cycles, using predictable intervals of fuel addition to structure daily activity. This informal system of timing replaced mechanical clocks in many situations, particularly in isolated rural homes where electricity was limited or unavailable. You begin to sense that rhythm again, not measured but felt. A faint creak travels through the upper floor, slower and more drawn out than before. The temperature difference between levels remains pronounced. Heat concentrates downstairs while cold lingers above, creating a vertical division within the same structure. Rural housing studies from the era note that this was a common feature of timber farmhouses, especially those built before standardized insulation practices became widespread. You imagine the upstairs rooms once more, still air, heavy blankets, and the subtle awareness of cold pressing against the edges of sleep. In many rural accounts, people describe winter nights as fragmented in rest, with frequent waking due to temperature shifts or wind noise passing through the structure. Some oral histories from farming regions mention shared bedding arrangements during extreme cold periods, where families adjusted sleeping positions to conserve warmth. These arrangements were not formal systems, but practical adaptations that emerged from necessity. You shift slightly near the stove again, noticing how sharply the boundary between warmth and cold is defined. Even a small movement, alters the sensation of temperature immediately. The lamp flickers softly, and the kitchen changes shape once more. Shadows stretch across the ceiling and walls, then settle back into place. Light here is never fixed. It continuously redraws the room in subtle variations in rural homes of this period. Lighting sources were often limited to oil lamps or battery-powered units when available, and their uneven reach shaped how space was experienced during nighttime hours. Objects are not fully seen at once, they are understood in partial illumination. Outside, the storm continues without interruption. Snow accumulation has now erased all visible structure beyond the window. There is no road, no fence, no horizon, only a continuous field of white motion that has slowed into near stillness through density. Contemporary accounts from rural winter events in the 1930s describe how extended snow cover could disrupt spatial awareness, making familiar surroundings difficult to interpret visually. Without contrast or landmarks, depth perception becomes uncertain. Researchers examining these accounts note differing interpretations of how significantly this affected daily rural life, though most agree it altered perception of outdoor space during prolonged storms. From inside the kitchen, that uncertainty is contained. The stove, table, and lamp provide anchors that stabilize orientation. A faint sound shifts through the house again, likely structural adjustment. Timber buildings in cold environments respond continuously to temperature fluctuations and wind pressure, producing a range of subtle sounds that become part of the background environment. These sounds are not disruptions, but indicators of ongoing adaptation. There is ongoing historical interpretation regarding rural life during prolonged winter confinement in the Great Depression era. Some researchers emphasize the importance of routine as a stabilizing mechanism that allowed households to maintain psychological continuity under environmental pressure. Others focus on the emotional complexity described in oral histories, where individuals recall both resilience and fatigue within the same experiences. The evidence suggests a wide spectrum of lived responses rather than a single unified pattern. You remain within that spectrum without needing to resolve it. The kitchen continues regardless. The stove emits another quiet adjustment as embers settle deeper. Heat expands outward in steady waves. This repetition has become the primary structure of time within the house, without external markers. The cycle of fire maintenance provides the most consistent sense of progression. Domestic habits recorded in rural accounts suggest that many households developed informal coordination between daily tasks and stove cycles. Cooking, cleaning, and rest periods were often aligned with moments when the fire required attention or stabilization. This created a natural rhythm that organized activity without formal scheduling. You can feel that rhythm embedded in the atmosphere of the kitchen. A faint smell persists in the air, likely from residual cooking or stored food warmed by proximity to heat. In rural kitchens of this era, smells often accumulated due to limited ventilation during winter months. Windows remained closed to preserve warmth, creating interior environments where sensory impressions layered over time. This layering contributes to the sense of continuity within the space. Nothing fully resets, everything carries forward. The table remained central, its surface marked by a repeated use. These marks are not decorative but functional traces of long-term activity. Material culture studies of rural households often interpret such wear as evidence of sustained adaptation, where objects are maintained and reused over extended periods rather than replaced frequently. You begin to see the table as a record of continuity rather than an object. Outside, the wind shifts slightly, and the farmhouse responds with a slow structural adjustment, not resistance, but accommodation. The building redistributes pressure across its frame in ways refined through years of exposure to seasonal extremes. Inside, warmth remains stable, light remains uneven but present. Time continues its slow accumulation without clear division or interruption. The night deepens further. holding the farmhouse within its enclosed rhythm of heat, structure, and quiet persistence. The farmhouse feels even more enclosed now, not physically smaller, but more self-contained, as if the storm outside has pressed the world inward and left only this structure as a functioning pocket of warmth and sound. You remain in the kitchen, though your awareness has begun to drift toward the edges of the house again, following faint movements and temperature shifts that define the interior geography. The stove continues its steady work, its presence so consistent that it almost disappears into the background of perception in rural farmhouses of the 1930s. This kind of heat source was more than comfort. It was the central mechanism around which daily life was organized. Housing studies from the period describe how kitchens often served as the primary living space during winter months, because they were the only reliably heated areas in the home. You can feel that truth embedded in the way this room holds everything together. A faint sound moves through the upper floor again, slightly different in tone this time. The colder air upstairs creates a sharper contrast in acoustics, making structural shifts more noticeable. Timber houses built in this era responded continuously to temperature fluctuations, and rural accounts often describe how winter nights were filled with subtle sounds of expansion and contraction. These were not disturbances so much as reminders that the structure was still actively adapting. You imagine the upstairs rooms once more, still, dim, and separated from the warmth below by both distance and temperature. In many rural households during this period, upper floors were used almost exclusively for sleeping during winter, with daily life concentrated downstairs where heating was possible. Some oral histories from farming communities describe how families adjusted sleeping arrangements during severe cold, sometimes clustering in the warmest rooms or sharing bedding to conserve heat. These practices were not standardized but emerged naturally from necessity. You shift slightly near the stove, and the difference between warmth and cold becomes immediately noticeable again. Even small movements alter your perception of the room's boundaries. The lamp flickers, and the kitchen reshapes itself once more. Shadows stretch across the ceiling and then recede. Light in this environment is unstable, continuously redefining spatial perception. In rural homes of this period, lighting was often limited to oil lamps or early electrical systems where available, and their uneven distribution created interiors where visibility was partial rather than complete. Objects exist here in degrees of clarity rather than full definition. Outside, the storm remains unchanged. Snow continues to accumulate silently, erasing what little structure might have remained beyond the window. There is no visible horizon, no road, no distinction between ground and sky. The world beyond the glass has become a continuous surface of motionless brightness. Historical accounts from rural winter storms in the 1930s describe how prolonged snow cover could alter spatial perception significantly. Without visual markers, distance becomes unreliable, and familiar landscapes lose their structure. Researchers examining these accounts note variations in interpretation regarding the psychological impact, but there is general agreement that environmental visibility played a major role in shaping rural winter experience. From inside the kitchen, that uncertainty is held at a distance. The stove, table, and lamp function as anchors that maintain orientation within the enclosed space. A faint structural sound moves through the house again. It is subtle but persistent, likely caused by wind pressure or temperature shifts affecting wooden joints. Timber construction in cold climates rarely remains acoustically neutral. Instead, it produces continuous low-level sound that becomes part of the background environment. There is ongoing historical interpretation regarding how rural households experienced extended winter isolation during the Great Depression. Some researchers emphasize the stabilizing role of routine, suggesting that repetitive daily patterns helped reduce uncertainty in environments dominated by external unpredictability. Others focus on the emotional complexity described in oral histories, where accounts reflect both resilience and strain depending on context. The evidence supports multiple interpretations rather than a single narrative. You remain within that complexity without needing resolution. The kitchen continues regardless of interpretation. The stove emits another quiet shift as embers settle deeper. Heat expands outward in steady, controlled waves. This cycle has become the primary temporal structure of the house, without clocks or external signals. The rhythm of fire maintenance defines the passage of time. A lesser-known domestic habit observed in rural household involved aligning household tasks with stove cycles. Activities such as cooking, cleaning, and rest were often coordinated around moments when the fire required attention, creating an informal synchronization between labor and environmental conditions. You can feel that synchronization embedded within the kitchen itself. A faint smell lingers in the air, likely tied to stored food or residual cooking heat. In rural kitchens of this era, smells often accumulated due to limited ventilation during winter months, as windows remained closed to preserve warmth. This created interior environments where sensory impressions layered over time, contributing to a sense of continuity within the space. Nothing here fully resets, everything carries forward. The table remains central, its surface marked by repeated use over many seasons. These marks are not decorative, but functional records of activity. Material culture studies of rural homes often interpret such wear as evidence of long-term adaptation, where objects are maintained and reused rather than replaced frequently. You begin to see the table as a continuous record of presence rather than an object. Outside, the wind shifts slightly, and the farmhouse responds with a slow, almost imperceptible adjustment. Not resistance, but accommodation. The structure distributes pressure through its frame in patterns shaped by years of seasonal exposure. Inside, warmth remains steady, light remains uneven but present. Time continues its gradual accumulation without clear division or interruption. The night deepens further, holding the farmhouse within its enclosed rhythm of heat, structure, and quiet persistence. The farmhouse now feels like it exists in a kind of suspended continuity, where nothing changes suddenly, but everything deepens gradually. You remain in the kitchen, though your awareness has begun to extend outward again, following the subtle acoustic and thermal signals that move through the house like quiet currents. The stove continues its steady rhythm, and by now it has become less of an object and more of a condition. In rural farmhouses of the 1930s, especially during prolonged winter storms, the stove often defined not only comfort but the entire structure of daily existence. Housing surveys and rural life records from the period describe how families organized their entire routines around maintaining consistent heat output, especially when fuel resources were limited. You can feel that dependency embedded in the room itself. Every surface seems oriented toward warmth, even without conscious intention. A faint structural sound moves through the ceiling again, slower and more drawn out than before. The upper floor remains significantly colder, and that temperature difference creates a layered acoustic environment. Timber buildings in cold climates often produce continuous low-level sound as materials expand and contract in response to shifting temperatures. Rural accounts frequently describe this phenomenon as part of the winter soundscape, something expected rather than unusual. You imagine the upstairs once more, dim, still, and slightly removed from the active warmth of the kitchen below. In many farmhouses of this era, upper rooms were primarily used for sleeping during winter months, with all other activity concentrated in heated lower spaces. This vertical separation of life within a single structure was not designed but adapted through experience. Some oral histories from farming regions describe how families adjusted sleeping arrangements during extreme cold, sometimes clustering together or sharing bedding more closely to retain warmth. These practices varied widely but reflect a consistent theme of environmental adaptation. You shift slightly near the stove and the change in temperature is immediate. Warmth here is not uniform, it is spatially precise, diminishing quickly with distance. This creates invisible boundaries within the room that guide movement without needing the instruction. The lamp flickers again, and the kitchen briefly transforms. Shadows stretch across the walls and ceiling before returning to their previous positions. Light in this environment is unstable by nature. In rural households of the 1930s, lighting sources were often limited and inconsistent, and this variability shaped how space was perceived after dark. Objects are never fully fixed in appearance. They exist in shifting partial clarity. Outside, the storm continues its uninterrupted presence. Snow accumulates in layers that erase all remaining distinctions in the landscape. The world beyond the window has become a continuous field of brightness, without depth or orientation. Contemporary rural accounts from severe winter events describe how extended snow cover could disrupt spatial awareness significantly. Without landmarks or contrast, distance becomes difficult to interpret, and familiar surroundings lose structure. Researchers examining these accounts note variations in interpretation regarding psychological impact. But most agree that visual deprivation played a key role in shaping winter experience in rural environments. From inside the kitchen, that uncertainty remains external. The stove, table, and lamp function as internal reference points that maintain orientation. A faint sound passes through the house again, likely structural adjustment caused by wind pressure. Timber construction in cold climates produces continuous low-level noise as materials respond to environmental stress. These sounds become part of the background rather than interruptions, gradually integrated into perception. There is ongoing historical interpretation regarding rural life during extended winter confinement in the Great Depression era. Some researchers emphasize the stabilizing influence of routine, suggesting that repetitive daily structures helped maintain psychological balance in conditions of environmental unpredictability. Others focus on accounts that highlight emotional complexity, where individuals describe both resilience and fatigue within the same experiences. The evidence suggests a wide range of lived responses rather than a singular narrative. You remain within that range without needing to resolve it. The kitchen continues regardless of interpretation. The stove shifts again as another piece of wood settles into embers. Heat expands outward in slow, controlled waves. This repetition has become the primary structure through which time is experienced inside the house, without external markers. The cycle of fire maintenance provides continuity and rhythm. A lesser-known domestic habit in rural households involved coordinating household tasks with stove cycles. Cooking, cleaning, and preparation activities were often timed around moments when the fire required attention or adjustment, creating an informal synchronization between labor and environmental conditions. You begin to feel that synchronization embedded within the atmosphere of the kitchen. A faint smell persists in the air, likely from stored food or residual cooking warmth. In rural kitchens of this period, odors often accumulated due to limited ventilation during winter months, as windows remained closed to preserve heat. This created layered sensory environments where impressions built over time rather than resetting. A thing here fully resets, everything continues forward. The table remains central, its surface marked by repeated use over many years. These marks are not decorative, but functional traces of sustained activity. Material culture studies of rural households often interpret such wear as evidence of long-term adaptation, where objects are maintained and reused rather than frequently replaced. You begin to see the table as a record of continuity rather than an object. Outside, the wind shifts slightly, and the farmhouse responds with a slow structural adjustment. Not resistance, but accommodation. The building distributes pressure through its frame in ways shaped by long experience with seasonal extremes. Inside, warmth remains steady. Light remains uneven but present. Time continues its gradual accumulation without clear division. The night deepens further, holding the farmhouse within its enclosed rhythm of heat, structure, and quiet persistence. The farmhouse feels as though it has fully settled into the deepest part of the night now, where even the idea of change seems distant. You remain in the kitchen, though your awareness begins to drift outward once again, following the faint signals of structure, heat, and sound that define the living presence of the house. The stove continues its steady cycle, and by now it has become less a feature of the room and more the foundation of it. In rural farmhouses of the 1930s, especially during extended winter storms, the stove was not simply a source of warmth, but the central organizing force of domestic life. Surviving agricultural reports from the era indicate that households often structured entire days around fuel management, ensuring that heat remained consistent through the night and into the following morning. You can feel that logic embedded in every corner of the kitchen. Nothing here exists without reference to warmth. A faint structural shift moves through the upper floor again, slower and more subdued than earlier. The temperature difference between levels continues to shape the house in subtle ways. Timber construction in cold climates naturally produces ongoing sound as materials respond to thermal variation, and rural accounts from the period often describe winter nights as filled with these quiet adjustments. You imagine the upstairs rooms once more, still, dim, and slightly removed from the concentrated heat below. In many rural households during this era, upper floors were reserved primarily for sleep during winter months, while daily life remained centered in heated lower rooms. This arrangement was not formal design, but practical adaptation shaped by necessity. Oral histories from farming communities describe how families often modified sleeping arrangements during severe cold spells, sometimes sharing bedding more closely or clustering in the warmest available spaces. These adjustments varied widely but reflect a consistent pattern of environmental responsiveness. You shift slightly near the stove, and the change in temperature is immediate and noticeable. Warmth is not evenly distributed here. It exists in gradients, fading quickly with distance and intensifying near its source. These invisible boundaries shape movement and behavior without requiring instruction. The lamp flickers, and the kitchen reshapes itself again. Shadows stretch across the walls and then recede. Light in this environment is never static. In rural homes of the 1930s, lighting systems were often limited and inconsistent, relying heavily on oil lamps or early electrical setups where available. This variability created interiors where perception shifted subtly over time, influencing how space was experienced during nighttime hours. Objects are not fully fixed in appearance, they exist in partial clarity, constantly redefined by changing light. Outside, the storm continues without interruption. Snow accumulates in continuous layers that erase all remaining structure in the landscape. The world beyond the window has become a uniform field of motionless brightness, without horizon or depth. Rural accounts from severe winter events in the 1930s describe how prolonged snow cover could significantly alter spatial awareness. Without visual markers, distance becomes difficult to judge, and familiar surroundings lose their recognizable form. Some historical analyses suggest this had measurable effects on navigation and daily movement, though interpretations differ regarding psychological impact. From inside the kitchen, that uncertainty remains contained. The stove, table, and lamp provide internal reference points that stabilize perception. A faint sound passes through the house again, likely caused by structural adjustment under wind pressure. Timber buildings in cold environments rarely remain acoustically still. They respond continuously to external forces, producing low-level sounds that gradually become part of the background environment. There is ongoing historical interpretation regarding rural life during extended winter isolation in the Great Depression. Some research emphasizes the stabilizing role of routine, suggesting that repetitive daily structures helped households maintain psychological continuity in conditions of environmental unpredictability. Other analyses focus on oral accounts that reflect emotional complexity, describing both resilience and fatigue within the same lived experiences. The evidence indicates a wide range of responses rather than a single unified pattern. You remain within that range without needing resolution. The kitchen continues regardless of interpretation. The stove shifts again as another piece of wood settles deeper into embers. Heat expands outward in slow, controlled waves. This repetition now defines the internal sense of time within the house, without clocks or external markers. The rhythm of fire maintenance becomes the primary structure through which the night is measured. A lesser-known domestic habit in rural households involved synchronizing daily tasks with stove cycles. Cooking, cleaning, and rest were often timed around moments when the fire required adjustment or fuel replenishment, creating an informal but consistent rhythm that aligned human activity with environmental conditions. You begin to sense that rhythm as something embedded in the atmosphere itself. A faint smell lingers in the air, likely tied to stored food or residual cooking warmth. In rural kitchens of this period, odours often accumulated due to limited ventilation during winter months. As windows remained closed to preserve heat, this created layered sensory environments where impressions built gradually over time rather than resetting. Nothing here fully resets. Everything carries forward. The table remains central, its surface marked by repeated use across seasons and years. These marks are not decorative but functional traces of sustained activity. Material culture studies of rural households often interpret such wear as evidence of long-term adaptation, where objects are maintained and reused rather than frequently replaced. You begin to see the table as a continuous record of presence rather than an object. Outside, the wind shifts slightly, and the farmhouse responds with a slow structural adjustment. Not resistance, but accommodation. The building distributes pressure through its frame in patterns shaped by long exposure to seasonal extremes. Inside, warmth remains steady, light remains uneven but present. Time continues its gradual accumulation without clear division or interruption. The night deepens further, holding the farmhouse within its enclosed rhythm of heat, structure, and quiet persistence. The farmhouse is no longer simply holding the night. It feels like it is carrying it, bearing its weight in every beam, every joint, every quiet shift of wood responding to cold. You remain in the kitchen, though even that location feels less like a fixed place, and more like a centre of gravity that everything else orbits around. The stove continues its steady presence, but there is a subtle change now, not in intensity, but in perception. The heat feels less like something being actively produced and more like something that has already been established and is now simply enduring. In rural farmhouses of the 1930s, especially during long winter storms, this moment often marked the quiet transition from active maintenance to sustained holding. Once the fire was properly built and stabilized, attention shifted from construction to preservation. Surviving rural household records from the period suggest that this was often the most critical phase of a winter night. Not the beginning when the fire was lit, not the moments of adjustment, but this long middle stretch where everything depended on what had already been done correctly. A stable fire meant survival through the remaining hours of darkness. You can feel that stability now, settled into the room like a second layer of warmth beneath the air. The lamp continues its uneven glow, though it feels softer now, as if even light is beginning to tire. Shadows still move, but they do so with less contrast. The kitchen no longer feels sharply divided between light and dark. Instead, it exists in a blended state, where edges soften and objects lose some of their defined separation. Outside, the storm remains present, but it has become less intrusive in awareness. The sound of wind is still there, but it no longer commands attention. Snow continues to accumulate in silence, building layers that will reshape the landscape completely by morning. In many rural accounts of winter storms from the 1930s, this final stage of the night is described as the most psychologically quiet. When the storm is no longer feared or resisted, but simply endured as background reality, you begin to sense that same quiet here. A faint movement passes through the upper floor again, though it is weaker now, almost indistinguishable from the settling of the house itself. Temperature differences remain, but they feel less pronounced. The farmhouse has adjusted fully to the cold outside, finding equilibrium in its internal structure. Timber, insulation gaps, and stored warmth all contribute to this fragile balance. You imagine the upper rooms one last time, not as separate spaces now, but as part of the same continuous system. Beds still holding warmth, blankets layered in quiet accumulation, sleep existing in shallow cycles, shaped by environment more than schedule. In many rural households of this era, winter nights often blurred the boundary between wakefulness and sleep. People would rest lightly, aware of the stove below, aware of wind outside, aware of the house continuing its small adjustments. Sleep was not always deep, but it was persistent. A lesser-known rural habit described in oral histories involved waking briefly during the night not out of alarm, but out of routine awareness, simply to confirm that the fire still held. These quiet checks were not always necessary, but they became part of lived rhythm during long storms. You remain still now, and even that stillness feels shared with the house. The stove emits one final, subtle shift as embers settle deeper into their long burn. Heat is no longer expanding in noticeable waves. It is simply present, evenly distributed, sustaining without effort. This is the state every winter night aims to reach in a place like this. Not intensity, but continuity. The table, the chairs, the shelves, all remain in their places, but they no longer feel separate from the atmosphere. They feel integrated into it. The kitchen is no longer a room with objects in it. It is a single environment composed of warmth, shadow, and time. Outside, the storm continues its slow work. But even that presence feels distant now. The farmhouse has narrowed its world to what is immediately necessary. Heat, shelter, breath, stillness. There is a quiet understanding embedded in this moment. Nothing more is required right now. Nothing more can be done. The lamp dims slightly again, and the room responds by softening further. Shadows lose their edges completely. The stove remains the only steady point of definition, though even it feels less visually dominant and more felt than seen. You are no longer tracking time in any structured way. There is only continuation. The farmhouse holds steady through the final stretch of night. Its structure adjusted perfectly to the conditions outside. Snow builds beyond the walls, wind continues its distant movement. But inside, everything has settled into equilibrium, and in that equilibrium, there is nothing left to chase or change, only rest waiting at the edge of awareness, wind down. Now the farmhouse begins to feel farther away, even though nothing has moved. The warmth of the stove remains, but it no longer asks for attention. It simply stays. The lamplight softens into something almost imagined, and the shapes in the kitchen lose their weight and definition. Outside, the storm is still there, but it no longer feels close. It becomes a distant presence. Something happening in another part of the world that no longer needs to be interpreted. The snow keeps falling, but even that motion feels slower now, as if it has entered its own long pause. You can let your thoughts loosen here. There is nothing to check, nothing to maintain, nothing to adjust, just the quiet sense of being inside a place that has already done everything it needs to do for the night. The farmhouse holds steady without effort. The stove keeps its final warmth. The walls remain still, and the night, once heavy and full of movement, begins to feel soft at the edges, breath by breath. Everything slows. The room fades not into darkness, but into calm continuity. There is no urgency left in it, only stillness that feels safe to rest inside. And now, even that stillness begins to fade gently away. Sweet dreams.